Book 3, Chapter 8 of The Smuggler by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Having now led the history of a great part of the personages in our drama up to the same point of time, namely, the third morning after the defeat of the smugglers, we may as well turn to follow out the course of Sir Edward Digby on a day that was destined to be eventful to all the parties concerned. On arriving at Woodchurch, he found a small body of dragoons ready mounted at the door of the little inn, and 2 saddled horses held waiting for their riders. Without ceremony, he entered and went up at once to Leighton's room, where he found him booted and spurred to set out, with Mole the officer standing by him, looking on, while Sir Henry placed some papers in a writing desk and locked them up. The young commander greeted his friend warmly, and then, turning to the officer of customs, said, "If you will mount, Mr. Mole, I will be down with you directly." And as soon as Mole, taking the hint, departed, he continued in a quick tone, but with a faint smile upon his countenance, "I know your errand, Digby, before you tell it. Edith has been transferred to the good charge and guidance of Mr. Radford, but that has only prepared me to act more vigorously than ever. My scruples on Sir Robert Croyland's account are at an end. Heaven and earth! Is it possible that a man can be so criminally weak as to give his child up, a sweet, gentle girl like that, to the charge of such a base, unprincipled scoundrel?" "Nay, nay, we must do Sir Robert justice," answered Digby. "It was done without his consent, indeed against his will, and a more impudent and shameless piece of trickery was never practised. You must listen for one moment, Leighton, though you seem in haste." And he proceeded to detail to him, as succinctly as possible, all that had occurred between Mr. Radford and Edith's father on the preceding evening, stating his authority and whence Zara had received her information. "That somewhat alters the case indeed," answered Leighton, "but I must not alter my conduct. I am indeed in haste, Digby, for I hope, ere 2 or 3 hours are over, to send the young scoundrel, for whose sake all this is done, a prisoner to the gaol. Mole has somehow got information of where he is, from undoubted authority, he says, and we are away to Iden Green in consequence. We shall get more information by the way, and I go with the party for a certain distance, in order to be at hand in case of need. But it does not do for me, in my position, to take upon me the capture of 6 smugglers. The command of the party will rest with Cornet Joyce. We will deal with Mr. Radford, the father, afterwards. But in the meantime, Digby, as your information certainly gives a different view of the case from that which I had before taken, you will greatly oblige me if you can contrive to ride over to Mr. Croyland's, and see if you can find Mr. Ward there. Beg him to let me have the directions he promised by 4 o'clock to-day, and if you do not find him, leave word to that effect with Mr. Croyland himself." "You seem to place a great faith in Ward," said Sir Edward Digby, shaking his head. I have cause, Digby," answered his friend, "but I must go, lest this youth escape me again." "Well, God speed you then," replied Digby. "I will go to Mr. Croyland at once, and contrive, I dare say, to get back to Harborne by breakfast time. It is not above 2 or 3 miles round, and I will go 20 at any time to serve you, Leighton." Sir Edward Digby found good Mr. Zachary Croyland walking about in his garden in a state of irritation indescribable. He also was aware by this time of what had befallen his niece, and such was his indignation that he could scarcely find it in his heart to be even commonly civil to anyone. On Sir Edward Digby delivering his message, as he found that Mr. Ward was not there, the old gentleman burst forth, exclaiming, "What have I to do with Ward, sir, or your friend either, sir? Your friend's a fool. He might have walked out of that door with Edith Croyland in his hand, and that's no light prize, let me tell you, but he chose to be delicate and gentlemanly, and all that sort of stupidity, and you see what has become of it. And now, forsooth, he sends over to ask advice and directions from Ward. Well, I will tell the man if I see him, though heaven only knows whether that will be the case or not." "Sir Henry Leighton seems to place great confidence in Mr. Ward," replied Digby, "which I trust may be justified." Mr. Croyland looked at him sharply for a moment from under his cocked hat, and then exclaimed, "Pish, you are a fool, young man. There, don't look so fierce. I've given over fighting for these 20 years, And besides, you wouldn't come to the duello with little Zara's uncle, would you? And he laughed immoderately, but splenetically enough at the same time. But I ought to have put my meaning as a question, not as a proposition, he continued. Are you such a fool as not to know the difference between an odd man and a madman, an eccentric man and a lunatic? If so, you had better get away as fast as possible, for you and I are likely soon to fall out. I understand what you mean about Ward quite well, but I can tell you that if you think Ward mad, I'm quite as mad as he is, only that his oddities lie all on the side of goodness and philanthropy, and mine now and then take a different course. But get you gone, get you gone. You are better than the rest of them, I believe. I do hope and trust you'll marry Zara, and then you'll plague each other's souls to my heart's content. He held out his hand as he spoke, and Digby shook it, laughing good-humouredly. But ere he had taken 10 steps towards the door of the house, through which he had to pass before he could mount his horse, Mr. Croyland called after him, Digby, Digby, Sir Edward, eldest son, I say, how could you be such a fool as not to run that fellow through the stomach when you had him at your feet? You see what a quantity of mischief has come of it. You are all fools together, you soldiers, I think, but it's true, a fool does as well as anything else to be shot at. How's your shoulder? Better, I suppose? I have not thought of it for the last 2 days, replied Digby. Well, that will do, said Mr. Croyland. Cured by the first intention. There, you may go. I don't want you. Only pray tell my brother that I think him as great a rascal as old Radford. He'll know how much that means. One's a weak rascal, the other's a strong one. That's the only difference between them, and Robert may fit on which cap he likes best. Digby did not think it necessary to stop to justify Sir Robert Croyland in his brother's opinion, but mounting his horse he rode back across the country towards Harborne as fast as he could go. He reached the house before the usual breakfast hour, but he found that everybody there had been an early riser as well as himself. The table was laid ready for breakfast, and Sir Robert Croyland was waiting in the drawing-room with some impatience in his looks. I think I am not too late, Sir Robert, said Digby, taking out his watch and bowing with a smile to Zara and Mrs. Barbara. No, oh dear, no, my young friend, replied the baronet. Only in such a house as this, breakfast is going on all the morning long, and I thought you would excuse me if I took mine a little earlier than usual, as I have got some way to go this morning. This was said as they were entering the breakfast-room, but Sir Edward Digby replied promptly, I must ask you to spare me 5 minutes before you go, Sir Robert, as I wish to speak with you for a short time. His host looked uneasy, for he was in that nervous and agitated state of mind in which anything that is not clear and distinct seems terrible to the imagination, from the consciousness that many ill-defined calamities are hanging over us. He said, Certainly, certainly, however, in a polite tone, but he swallowed his breakfast in haste, and the young officer perceived that his host looked at every mouthful he took, as if likely to procrastinate the meal. Zara's face, too, was anxious and thoughtful, and consequently he hurried his own breakfast as fast as possible, knowing that the signal to rise would be a relief to all parties. If you will come into my little room, Sir Edward, said the master of the house, as soon as he saw that his guest was ready, I shall be very happy to hear what you have to say. Sir Edward Digby followed in silence, and, to tell the truth, his heart beat a good deal, though it was not one to yield upon slight occasions. I will not detain you a moment, Sir Robert, he said, when they had entered, and the door was shut, for what I have to say will be easily answered. I am sensible that yesterday my attention to your youngest daughter must have been remarked by you, and indeed my manner altogether must have shown you and herself also that I feel differently towards her and other women. I do not think it would be right to continue such conduct for 1 moment longer without your approbation of my suit, and I can only further say that if you grant me your sanction, I feel that I can love her deeply and well, that I will try to make her happy to the best of my power, and that my fortune is amply sufficient to maintain her in the station of life in which she has always moved, and to make such a settlement upon her as I trust will be satisfactory to you. I will not detain you to expatiate upon my feelings, but such is a soldier's straightforward declaration, and I trust you will countenance and approve of my addressing her." Sir Robert Croyland shook him warmly by the hand. "My dear Sir Edward," he said, "you are your father's own son, frank, candid, and honourable. He was one of the most gentlemanly and amiable men I ever knew, and it will give me heartfelt pleasure to see my dear child united to his son. But, indeed, I must deal with you as candidly." He hesitated for a moment or two, and then went on. "Perhaps you think that circumstances here are more favourable than they really are. Things may come to your knowledge. Things may have to be related. Zara's fortune will be—" Sir Edward Digby saw that Sir Robert Croyland was greatly embarrassed, and for an instant, for love is a very irritable sort of state, at least for the imagination, and he was getting over head and ears in love, notwithstanding all his good resolutions. For an instant, I say, he might think that Zara had been engaged before, and that Sir Robert was about to tell him that it was not the ever-coveted first freshness of the heart he was to possess in her love, even if it were gained entirely. But a moment's thought in regard to her father's situation, together with the baronet's last words, dispelled that unpleasant vision, and he replied eagerly, "Oh, my dear sir, that can make no difference in my estimation. If I can obtain her full and entire love, no external circumstance whatsoever can at all affect my views. I only desire her hand." "No external circumstances whatsoever," said Sir Robert Croyland, pausing on the words. "Are you sure of your own firmness, Sir Edward Digby? If her father were to tell you he is a ruined man, if he had many circumstances to relate which might make it painful to you to connect yourself with him, I do not say that it is so, but if it were—" "Rather an awkward position," thought Sir Edward Digby, but his mind was fully made up, and he replied without hesitation, "It would still make no difference in my eyes, Sir Robert. I trust that none of these terrible things are the case for your sake, but I should despise myself if, with enough of my own, I made fortune any ingredient in my considerations, or if I could suffer my love, a being perfectly amiable in herself, to be affected by the circumstances of her family." Sir Robert Croyland wrung his hand hard, and Digby felt that it was a sort of compact between them. "I fear I must go," said Zara's father, "and therefore I cannot explain more. But it is absolutely necessary to tell you that all my unmortgaged property is entailed, and will go to my brother, that Edith's fortune is totally independent, and that Zara has but a tithe of what her sister has." "Still I say, as I said before," replied Digby, "that nothing of that kind can make any difference to me, nor will I ever suffer any consideration not affecting your daughter personally, and I beg this may be clearly understood, to make any change in my views. If I can win her love, her entire, full, hearty love, with your sanction, she is mine. Have I that sanction, Sir Robert?" "Fully, and from my heart," replied Sir Robert Croyland, with the unwonted tears coursing over his cheeks. "Go to her, my dear friend, go to her, and make what progress you may, with my best wishes. This is indeed a great happiness, a great relief." Thus saying, he followed Sir Edward Digby out of the room, and mounting a new horse which had been brought up from his bailiff's, he rode slowly and thoughtfully away. As he went, a faint hope, nay, it could hardly be called a hope, a vague, wild fancy of explaining his whole situation to Sir Edward Digby, and gaining the blessed relief of confidence and counsel, arose in Sir Robert Croyland's breast. Alas, what an unhappy state has been brought about by the long accumulation of sin and deceit which has gathered over human society, that no man can trust another fully, that we dare not confide our inmost thoughts to any, that there should be a fear, the necessity for a fear, of showing the unguarded heart to the near and dear, that every man should, according to the most accursed axiom of a corrupt world, live with his friend as if he were one day to be his enemy. O truths and honour and sincerity, O true Christianity, whither are ye gone? Timidity soon banished such thoughts from the breast of Sir Robert Croyland, though there was something in the whole demeanour of his daughter's lover which showed him that, if ever man was to be trusted, he might trust there, and had he known how deeply Digby was already acquainted with much that concerned him, he might perhaps have gone one step farther and told him all. As it was, he rode on, and soon gave himself up to bitter thoughts again. In the meantime, Sir Edward Digby returned to Zara and Mrs. Barbara in the drawing-room, with so well satisfied a look that it was evident to both his conversation with Sir Robert had not referred to any unpleasant subject, and had not any unpleasant result. He excited the elder lady's surprise, however, and produced some slight agitation to the younger, by taking Zara by the hand, and in good set terms of almost formal courtesy, requesting a few minutes' private audience. Her varying colour and her hesitating look showed her lover that she apprehended something more unpleasant than he had to say, and he whispered as they went along towards the library, it is nothing but to tell you what I have done, and to arrange our plan of campaign." Zara looked up in his face with a glad smile, as if his words took some terror from her heart, and as soon as he was in the room, he let go her hand and turned the key in such a manner in the door that the keyhole could not serve the purpose of a perspective glass, even if it might that of an ear-trumpet. "Forgive me, dear Zara," he said, "if I take care to secure our defences. Otherwise, as your good aunt is perfectly certain that I am about to fall on my knees and make my declaration, she might be seized with a desire to witness the scene, not at all aware that it has been performed already. But not to say more," he continued, "on a subject on which you have kindly and frankly set a lover's heart at rest, let me only tell you that your father has fully sanctioned my suit, which I know, after what you have said, will not be painful to you to hear." "I was sure he would," answered Zara. "Not that he entered into any of my aunt's castles in the air, or that he devised my schemes, Digby, but doubtless he wishes to see a fortuneless girl well married, and would have been content with a lover for her who might not have suited herself quite so well. You see, I deal frankly with you, Digby, still, and will do so both now and hereafter, if you do not check me." "Never, never will I," answered Sir Edward Digby. "It was so you first commanded my esteem, even before my love, and so you will always keep it." "Before your love?" said Zara in an unwontedly serious tone. "Your love is very young yet, Digby, and sometimes I can hardly believe all this to be real. Will it last, or will it vanish away like a dream, and leave me waking, alone and sorrowful?" "And yours for me, Zara?" asked her lover, but then he added quickly, "No, I will not put an unfair question, and every question is unfair that is already answered in one's own heart. Yours will, I trust, remain firm for me, so mine, I know, will for you, because we have seen each other under circumstances which have called forth the feelings and displayed fully all the inmost thoughts which years of ordinary intercourse might not develop. But now, dear Zara, let us speak of our demeanour to each other. It will perhaps give us greater advantage if you treat me, perhaps as a favoured, but not yet an accepted lover. I will appear willingly as your humble slave and follower, if you will. Now and then, let me know in private that I am something dearer, and by keeping up the character with me which has gained you your uncle's commendation as a fair coquette, you may, perhaps, reconcile Mrs. Barbara to many things, which her notions of propriety might interfere with, if they were done as between the betrothed." "I fear I shall manage it but badly, Digby," she answered. "It was very easy to play the coquette before, when no deeper feelings were engaged, when I cared for no one, when all were indifferent to me. It might be natural to me then, but I do not think I could play the coquette with the man I loved. At all events, I should act the part but badly, and should fancy he was always laughing at me in his heart, and triumphing over poor Zachary Croyland, when he knew right well that he had the strings of the puppet in his hand. However, I will do my best if you wish it, and I do believe, from knowing more of this house than you do, that your plan is a good one. The airs I have given myself and the freedom I have taken have been of service both to myself and Edith, to her in many ways, and to myself in keeping from me all serious addresses from men I could not love. Yours is the first proposal I have ever had, Digby, so do not let what my uncle has said make you believe that you have conquered a queen of hearts who has set all others at defiance." "No gentleman was ever refused by a lady," answered Digby, laying a strong emphasis on each noun substantive. "So then, you were quite sure before you said a word?" cried Zara, laughing. "Well, that is as frank a confession as any of my own, and yet you might have been mistaken, for esteeming you as I did, and circumstanced as I was, I would have trusted you as much, Digby, if you had been merely a friend." "But you would not have shown me the deeper feelings of your heart upon other indifferent subjects," replied her lover. Zara blushed and looked down, then suddenly changed the course of conversation, saying, "But you have not told me what Leighton thought of all this, and what plans you have formed. What is to be done? Was he not deeply grieved and shocked?" Sir Edward Digby told her all that had passed, and then added, "I intend now to send out my servant, Summers, to reconnoitre. He shall waylay Leighton on his return, and bring me news of his success. If this youth be safely lodged in gaol, his pretensions are at an end, at least for the present. But if he again escape, I think, ere noon to-morrow, I must interfere myself. I have now a better right to do so than I have hitherto had, and what I have heard from other quarters will enable me to speak boldly, even to your father, dear one, without committing either you or Edith." Zara paused and thought, but all was still dark on every side, and she could extract no ray of light from the gloom. Digby did not fail, as how could a lover neglect, to try to lead her mind to pleasanter themes, and he did so in some degree. But we have been too long eavesdropping upon private intercourse, and we will do so no more. The rest of the day passed in that mingled light and shade, which has a finer interest than the mere broad sunshine, till the return of Sir Robert Croyland, when the deep sadness that overspread his countenance clouded the happiness of all the rest. Shortly after, Zara saw her lover's servant ride up the road at considerable speed, and as it wanted but half an hour to dinner time, Digby, who marked his coming also, retired to dress. When he returned to the drawing-room, there was a deeper and a sterner gloom upon his brow than the fair girl had ever seen. But her father and aunt were both present, and no explanation could take place. After dinner, too, Sir Robert Croyland and his guest returned to the drawing-room together, and though the cloud was still upon Digby's countenance, and he was graver than he had ever before appeared, yet she whom he loved could gain no tidings. To her he was still all tenderness and attention, but Zara could not play the part she had undertaken, and often her eyes rested on his face with a mute, sad questioning, which made her aunt say to herself, "Well, Zara is in love at last." Thus passed a couple of hours, during which not above 10 words were uttered by Sir Robert Croyland. At length lights were brought in, after they had been for some time necessary, and at the end of about 10 minutes more, the sound of several horses coming at a quick pace was heard. The feet stopped at the great door, the bell rang, and voices sounded in the hall. The tones of one deep, clear, and mellow made both Zara and her father start, and in a minute after the butler entered. He was an old servant, saying, in a somewhat embarrassed manner, "Colonel Sir Henry Leighton, sir, wishes to speak with you immediately on business of importance." "Who?" demanded Sir Robert. "Sir Henry Leighton? Well, take him in somewhere." He rose from his chair, but staggering perceptibly for a moment, then overcoming the emotion that he could not but feel, he steadied himself by the arm of his chair, and left the room. Zara gazed at Digby, and he at her he loved, but this night Mrs. Barbara thought fit to sit where she was, and Digby, approaching Zara's seat, bent over her, whispering, "Leighton has a terrible tale to tell, but not affecting Edith. She is safe. What more he seeks, I do not know." End of chapter 8. Book 3, Chapter 9 of The Smuggler by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. After parting with Sir Edward Digby at Woodchurch, Henry Leighton had ridden on at a quick pace to Parkgate, and thence along the high road to Cranbrook. He himself was habited in the undress of his regiment, though with pistols at his saddle and a heavy sword by his side. One of his servants followed him similarly accoutred, and an orderly accompanied the servant, while by the young officer's side appeared our good friend, Mr. Mole, heavily armed, with the somewhat anomalous equipments of a riding officer of customs in those days. At a little distance behind this first group came Cornet Joyce and his party of dragoons, and in this order they all passed through Cranbrook about 9 o'clock, but a quarter of a mile beyond the little town they halted, and Mole rode on for a short way alone to the edge of Hangley Wood, which was now close before them. There he dismounted and went in amongst the trees, but he was not long absent, for in less than 5 minutes he was by the Colonel's side again. "All's right, sir," he said. "The boy assures me that they were all there still, at 6 this morning, and that their captain, Radford, does not move till after dark to-night. So now we shall have the worst fellows amongst them, the 2 Ramleys and all." "Well then," answered Leighton, "you had better go on at once with the party, keeping through the wood. I will remain behind, coming on slowly, and if wanted, you will find me somewhere in the hangar. Cornet Joyce has his orders in regard to surrounding the house, but of course he must act according to circumstances." No more words were needed. The party of dragoons moved on rapidly, with Mole at their head, and Leighton, after pausing for a few minutes on the road, dismounted, and giving his rein to the servant, walked slowly on into the wood, telling the 2 men who accompanied him to follow. There was at that time, as there is now, I believe, a broad road through Hangley Wood, leading into the crossroad from Biddenden to Goudhurst, but at that period, instead of being tolerably straight and good, it was very tortuous, rough and uneven. Along this forest path, for so it might be called, the dragoons had taken their way, at a quick trot, and by it their young colonel followed, with his arms crossed upon his chest, and his head bent down, in deep and anxious meditation. The distance across the wood at that part is nearly a mile, and when he had reached the other side, Leighton turned upon his steps again, passed his servant and the orderly, and walked slowly on the road back to Cranbrook. The 2 men went to the extreme verge of the wood, and looked out towards Iden Green for a minute or 2 before they followed their officer, so that in the turnings of the road they were out of sight by the time he had gone a quarter of a mile. Leighton's thoughts were busy, as may be well supposed, but at length they were suddenly interrupted by loud, repeated, and piercing shrieks, apparently proceeding from a spot at some distance before him. Darting on with a single glance behind, and a loud shout to call the men up, he rushed forward along the road, and the next instant beheld a sight which made his blood boil with indignation. At first he merely perceived a girl, struggling in the hands of some 5 or 6 ruffians, who were maltreating her in the most brutal manner. But in another instant, as, drawing his sword, he rushed forward, he recognised, for it can scarcely be said he saw, poor Kate Clare. With another loud shout to his men to come up, he darted on without pause or hesitation. But his approach was observed. The ruffians withdrew from around their victim, and one of them exclaimed, "Run, run, the dragoons are coming." "Dear me, give her a shot before you go," cried another, "or she'll peach." "Let her," cried young Radford, "but here goes," and turning as he hurried away, he deliberately fired a pistol at the unhappy girl, who was starting up wildly from the ground. She instantly reeled and fell, some seconds before Leighton could reach her, for he was still at the distance of 100 yards. All this had taken place in an inconceivably short space of time, but the next minute the panic with which the villains had been seized subsided a little. One turned to look back, another turned. They beheld but 1 man on the road, and all the party were pausing, when Leighton reached poor Kate Clare, and raised her in his arms. It might have fared ill with him had he been alone, but just at that moment the orderly appeared at the turn, coming up at the gallop, with the young officer's servant behind him, and not doubting that a large party was following, Radford and his companions fled as fast as they could. "On after them, like lightning," cried Leighton, as the men came up. Leave the horse and away. Watch them wherever they go, especially the man in the green coat. Take him if you can, shoot him dead if you resist." "Ah, my poor girl," he cried, with the tears rising in his eyes, "this is sad indeed. Where has he wounded you?" "There, said Kate faintly, taking away her hand, which was pressed upon her right side. "But that was his kindest act. Thank God I am dying." "Nay, nay," answered Leighton, "I trust not." But the blood poured rapidly out, staining all her dress, which was torn and in wild disorder, and so rapidly did it flow that Leighton clearly saw her words would probably prove true. "Who was that villain?" he cried. "I will punish him if there be justice on earth." "Don't you know him?" said Kate, her voice growing more and more low. "I thought you were seeking him. Richard Radford." "The atrocious scoundrel!" said Leighton, and drawing his handkerchief from his breast, he tied it tightly over her side, trying, though he saw it was clearly in vain, to stanch the blood, while at the same time he supported her against his knee with one arm thrown round her waist. Poor Kate closed her eyes with a faint shudder, and for a moment Leighton thought she was dead. She appeared to be reviving again, however, when a loud voice, not far distant, exclaimed, "Hello!" "What the devil is this?" Leighton looked suddenly up, for his eyes had been bent upon the poor girl's face for several minutes, and then beheld, hurrying up the road with a look of fury in his countenance, Kate's promised husband, Harding. With a violent oath, the man rushed on, exclaiming, "Kate, what is all this? Villain, have you misused the girl?" "Hush, hush!" cried Leighton with a stern gesture of his hand. "She's dying. I would have saved her if I could, but alas, I came too late." The whole expression of Harding's countenance changed in an instant. Grief and terror succeeded to rage, and catching her frantically in his arms, he exclaimed, "Kate, Kate, speak to me. Tell me, who has done this?" "I can tell you," answered Leighton. "Richard Radford." While he was speaking, Kate Clare opened her eyes again and gazed on Harding's face, moving her right hand faintly round and placing it upon his. "Give me that handkerchief from your neck," said Leighton. "If we can stop the blood, we may save her yet. I have seen very bad wounds recovered from." "No, no," said Kate Clare. "Thank God I am dying. I would rather die. Harding, I am not in fault. They caught me in the wood. Oh, they treated me horribly. Mr. Radford said it was revenge. God forgive him. God forgive him. But I would rather die thus in your arms. Do not try to stop it. It is all in vain." Leighton and Harding still persisted, however, and bound another handkerchief tight over the wound, in some degree diminishing the stream of blood, but yet not stopping it entirely. "Let us carry her to some house," cried Leighton, "and then send for assistance. See, her lips are not so pale." "I will carry her," said Harding, raising her in his powerful arms. "To my aunt's, then?" "To my aunt's, Harding," murmured Kate. "I would sooner die there than in any other place." And on Harding sped without reply, while Leighton, sheathing his sword, which he had cast down, followed him, inquiring, "Is it far?" "But a step, sir," answered the smuggler. "Pray come with us. This must be avenged." "It shall," replied Leighton sternly. "But I must stay here for a minute or two, till you can send somebody to me, to take my place, and let my men know where I am when they return." Harding nodded his head, and then turned his eyes upon the face of the poor girl whom he bore in his arms, hurrying on without a moment's pause, till he was lost to the young officer's sight. It is needless to describe the feelings of a high-minded and noble man like Leighton, when left alone to meditate over the horrible outrage which had been committed under his very eyes. He gave way to no burst of indignation, indeed, but with a frowning brow walked back upon the road, caught his horse without difficulty, and mounting, remained fixed near the spot where poor Kate had received her death wound, like a soldier upon guard. In less than 10 minutes a lad ran up, saying, "Mr. Harding sent me, sir." "Well then, walk up and down here, my good boy," replied Leighton, "till someone comes to inquire for me. If it should be a servant or a single soldier, send him down to the place which you came from, and wait where you are till a larger party of dragoons come up, when you must tell them the same, to go down to me there. If the party come first, wait for the servant and the soldier." Having given these directions, he was turning away, but paused again to inquire his way to the place where Harding was, and then, pointing to a bundle that lay upon the road, he said, "You had better bring that with you." Following the boy's direction, as soon as he issued out of the wood, Sir Henry Leighton turned through a little field to the left, and seeing a small farmhouse at some distance before him, he leaped his horse over 2 fences to abridge the way. Then, riding into the farmyard, he sprang to the ground, looking round for someone to take his charger. Several men of different ages were running about with eagerness and haste in their faces. Horses were being led forth from the stable, guns were in the hands of several, and one of them, a fine, tall, powerful young fellow, exclaimed as soon as he saw Leighton, "We will catch them, sir, we will catch them, and by , they shall be hanged as high as Haman for hurting a poor dead girl. Here, take his honour's horse, Bill." "Is she still living?" asked Leighton. "Oh dear, yes, sir," cried the young man. "She seemed somewhat better for what mother gave her." "Well then," rejoined the young officer, "if you are going to search for these scoundrels, gallop up to the wood as fast as you can. You will find my servant and a trooper watching. They will give you information of which way the villains are gone. I will join you in a minute or two with a stronger force." "Oh, sir, we shall do, cried William Harris. "We will raise the whole county as we go, and will hunt them down like foxes. Do they think that our sisters and our wives are to be ill-used and murdered by such scum as they are?" And at the same time he sprang upon his horse's back. Leighton turned towards the house, but met the old farmer himself coming out with a great cavalry sword in his hand, and the butt end of a pistol sticking out of each pocket. "Quick, quick, to your horses," he cried. "They shall rue the day, they shall rue the day. Ah, sir, go in," he continued, seeing Leighton. "She is telling my wife and Harding all about it, but I can't stop to hear. I will have that young Radford's blood if I have a soul to be saved." "Better take him alive and hand him over to justice," said Leighton, going into the house. "D him, I'll kill him like a dog," cried the farmer, and mounting somewhat less nimbly than his son, he put himself at the head of the whole party assembled, and rode fast away towards Hangley Wood. In the meantime Leighton entered the kitchen of the farm, but it was quite vacant. Voices, however, were heard speaking above, and he ventured to go up and enter the room. 3 or 4 women were assembled there round good Mrs. Harris's own bed, on which poor Kate Clare was stretched, with Harding on his knees beside her, and her hand in his, the hot tears of man's bitterest agony coursing each other down his bronzed and weather-beaten cheek. "There, there," said Mrs. Harris, "don't take on so, Harding. You only keep down her spirits. She might do very well if she would but take heart. You see she's better for the cordial stuff I gave her." Harding made no reply, but Kate Clare faintly shook her head, and Leighton, after having gazed on the sad scene for a moment, with bitter grief and indignation in his heart, drew back, thinking that his presence would only be a restraint to Kate's family and friends. He made a sign, however, to one of the women before he went, who followed him out of the room. "I merely wish to tell you," he said in a low voice, when the woman joined him at the top of the stairs, "that I am going back to the wood to aid in the pursuit of these villains, for I can be of no use here and may be there. If any of my people come, tell them where to find me, bid them follow me instantly, and stop every man on foot they see quitting the wood, till he gives an account of himself. But had you better not send for a surgeon?" "One is sent for, sir," replied the woman, "but I think she is not so bad as she was. I'll take care and tell your people. I do hope they will catch them, for this is too bad." Without more words, Leighton went down, remounted his horse, and galloped back towards the edge of the wood. The news of what had happened, however, seemed to have spread over the country with the speed of lightning, and he saw 4 or 5 of the peasantry on horseback already riding in the same direction across the fields. 2 stout farmers joined him as he went, and both were already full of the story of poor Kate Clare. Rage and indignation were universal amongst the people, but as usual on such occasions, one proposed one plan and another the other, so that by want of combination in their operations all their resolution and eagerness were likely to be fruitlessly employed. Leighton knew that it was of little use to argue on such points with undisciplined men, and his only trust was in the speedy arrival of the soldiers from Iden Green. When he reached the edge of the wood, however, with his 2 companions, they came upon Farmer Harris's party, now swelled to 12 or 13 men, and at the same moment his own servant rode round, exclaiming, as soon as he saw his master, "They are in the wood, sir, if they have not come out this way. They dispersed so that we could not follow them in horseback, and we galloped out by different ways to watch." "They haven't come here," cried Farmer Harris, "or we should have seen them. So now we have them safe enough." "Ride off towards Iden Green," said Leighton to the servant, "and direct Cornet Joyce to bring down his men at the gallop to the edge of the copse. Let him dismount 12 on the north side of the wood, and with all the farm servants and country people he can collect, sweep it down, while the rest of the mounted men advance in a line on either side. Stay, I will write," and tearing a leaf out of his pocket-book, he put down his orders in pencil. The man had just galloped away when the young farmer, William Harris, shouted, "There they go, after them, tally-ho," and instantly set spurs to his horse. All the rest but Leighton followed at full speed, but he paused, and directing his eyes along the edge of the wood, clearly saw at the distance of somewhat more than half a mile 3 men who seemed to have issued forth from amongst the trees, running across the fields as fast as they could go. It would seem that they had not been aware of the numbers collected to intercept them, till they had advanced too far to retreat, but they had got a good start. The country was difficult for any but well-trained horses, and darting on, they took their way towards Goudhurst, passing within 100 yards of the spot where the victim of their horrid barbarity lay upon the bed of death. Taking the narrow paths, leaping the stiles and gates, they at first seemed to gain upon the mass of peasantry who followed them, though their pursuers were on horseback and they on foot. But well knowing the country, the farmers spread out along the small bridle roads, and while the better mounted horsemen followed direct across the fields, the others prepared to cut off the ruffians on the right and left. Gradually a semicircle enclosing them within its horns was thus formed, and all chance of escape by flight was thus cut off. In this dilemma the 3 miscreants made straight towards a farmhouse at which they occasionally received hospitality in their lawless expeditions, and which bears the name of Smuggler Farm to this day, and they knew not that all hearts had been raised against them by their late atrocities, and that the very tenant of the farm himself was now one of the foremost in pursuit. Rushing in then, with no farther ceremony than casting the door open, they locked and barred it, just as some of the peasantry were closing in upon them, and then, hurrying to the kitchen where the farmer's wife, his sister, and a servant was collected, Ned Ramley, who was the first, exclaimed, "Have you no hide, good dame?" "Hide?" replied the stout farmer's wife, eyeing him askance. "Not for such villains as you. Give me the spit, Madge. I have a great mind to run him through." Ned Ramley drew a pistol from his pocket, but at that moment the window was thrown open, the back door of the house was cast open, and 6 of the stout yeomanry rushed in. The smugglers saw that resistance would be vain, but still they resisted, and though, in the agitation of the moment, Ned Ramley's pistol was discharged innocuously, he did not fail to aim it at the head of young William Harris, who was springing towards him. The stout farmer, however, instantly levelled him with the ground with a thundering blow upon the head, and the other 2 men, after a desperate struggle, were likewise taken and tied. "Lucky for you it was me and not my father, Master Ramley," said William Harris. "He'd have blown your brains out, but you're only saved to be hanged anyhow. Aye, here he comes. Stop, old gentleman. He's a prisoner. Don't you touch him. Let the law have the job, as the gentleman said." "Oh, you accursed villain! Oh, you hellish scoundrel!" cried old Harris, kept back with difficulty by his son and the rest. "You were one of the foremost of them, but where is the greatest villain of them all? Where's that limb of the devil, young Radford? I will have him. Let me go, Will. I will have him, I say." Ned Ramley laughed aloud. "You won't, though," he answered bitterly. "He's been gone this half hour, and will be at the sea and over the sea before you can catch him. You may do with me what you like, but he's safe enough." "Some one ride off and tell the officer what he says," cried the farmer. But when the intelligence was conveyed to Sir Henry Leighton, he was already aware that some of the men must have made their escape unobserved, for his servant had met Cornet Joyce and the party of dragoons by the way, and with the aid of a number of farm servants from Iden Green and its neighbourhood, the wood had been searched with such strictness that the pheasants, which were at that time numerous there, had flown out in clouds as if a battle had been going on. He mistrusted Ned Ramley's information, however, knowing that the hardened villain would find a sort of pride in misleading the pursuers of young Radford, even though taken himself. Riding quickly across to the farm then, together with Mole and the cornet, he interrogated the men separately, but found they were all in the same story, from which they varied not in the least, that Richard Radford had crept out by the hedges near the wood, and had gone first to a place where a horse was in waiting for him, and thence would make straight to the seaside, where a boat was already prepared. Instant measures to prevent him from executing this plan now became necessary, and Leighton directed the cornet to hasten away as fast as possible in pursuit, sending information from Woodchurch to every point of the coast where the offender was likely to pass, spreading out his men so as to cover all the roads to the sea, and only leaving at the farm a sufficient guard to secure the prisoners. On hearing the latter part of this order, however, Farmer Harris exclaimed, "No, no, sir, no need of that. We've taken them, and we'll keep them safe enough. I'll see these fellows into prison myself, aye, and hanged too, please God, and we'll guard them sure, don't you be afraid." Leighton looked to Mole, saying, "I must abide by your decision, Mr. Mole," but the officer answered, "Oh, you may trust them, sir, quite safely, after all I hear has happened. But I think, Mr. Harris, you had better have just a few men to help you. You've got no place to keep them here, and they must be taken before a magistrate first before they can be committed." "Oh, we'll keep them safe enough," replied the farmer. "We'll put them in Goudhurst Church till we can send them off, and in the meantime I'll have them up before Squire Broughton. His son's a constable, so they are in proper hands." "Very well," answered Leighton. "In this case I have no right to interfere, but of course you are responsible for their safe custody." "I say, Mole," cried Ned Ramley in his usual daring manner, "bid them give me something to drink, for I'm devilish thirsty, and I'll give you some information if you will." Mole obtained some beer for him, and then demanded, "Well, what is it, Ned?" "Why, only this," said Ned Ramley, after they had held the beer to his lips, and he had taken a deep draught. "You will have your brains blown out before 10 days are over." "I'm not afraid," replied Mole, laughing. "That's right," answered Ned Ramley, "but it will happen, for 50 of us has sworn it. We have had our revenge of your spy, Harding, and we have only you to settle with now." "Harding!" cried Mole. "He's no spy of mine. It was not he that peached you, young scoundrel. It was one of those whom you trusted more than him." "Oh, well," answered Ned Ramley indifferently, "then he'll have a sore heart to-night that he didn't work for. But you'll have your turn yet, Mr. Mole, so look that you make good use of your brains, for they won't be long in your skull." "You're a hardened villain," said Sir Henry Leighton. "You had better march them off as fast as you can, my good friends. Take them before a magistrate, and above all things get them to prison ere nightfall, or we may have another rescue." No fear," answered Farmer Harris. "To rescue a smuggler is one thing. I never liked to see them taken myself, but bloodthirsty villains like these, that would ill-use a poor, dear, good girl, and murder her in cold blood, why, there is not a man in the county would not help to hang them. But I wish, sir, you would go yourself and see and stop that other great villain. If he isn't hanged too, I don't think I shall ever rest in my bed again." "I will do my best, depend upon it," replied Leighton. "But I must first, Mr. Harris, go to your house and see the state of that poor girl. I have known her since she was a child, and feel for her almost as if she were a sister." "Thank you, sir, thank you," cried old Harris, shaking him by the hand. "There, boys," he continued, dashing away the tears from his eyes, "make a guard and take these blackguards off in the middle of you. We'll have them up to Squire Broughton's at once, and then I must go back too." On his way to the farm, Leighton desired Mole to return to Woodchurch, and to wait for him there, taking every step that he might think necessary with the aid of Captain Irby. "I will not be long," he added. "Pray don't, sir," rejoined Mole, "for we have other business to do to-night." And sinking his voice to a whisper, he added, I've got the information I wanted, sir. A part of the goods are certainly at Radford Hall, and if we can seize them there, that, with the deposition of the men at Woodchurch, will bring him in for the whole offence." "I shall very likely overtake you on the way," replied Leighton, "but, at all events, I shall be there before 4. Most such calculations are vain, however. Leighton turned aside to the Harrises' farm, where he found poor Kate Clare sinking rapidly. The curate of the parish had been sent for, and, by his advice, Mr. Broughton, the magistrate, who had entered the house but 2 or 3 minutes before Leighton himself. Though her voice now scarcely rose above a whisper, she made her dying declaration with clearness and accuracy. It is not necessary here to give any of the details, but as she concluded she turned her faint and swimming eyes towards Leighton, saying, "That gentleman, who has always been such a good friend to me and mine, can tell you more, sir, for he came up to my help just as they shot me." The magistrate raised his eyes and inquired in a low tone, "Who is he?" "Sir Henry Leighton," replied the poor girl, loud enough for that officer to hear, and thinking that she asked for him, he approached nearer, and stood by Harding's side. Kate raised her hand a little from the bedclothes, as if she would have given it to him, and he took it kindly in his, speaking some words of comfort. "Thank you, sir, thank you for all your kindness," said Kate. "I am glad you have come, that I may wish you good-bye, and ask you to be kind to poor Harding too. It will soon be over now, and you had better all leave me. Not you, Harding, not you. You must close my eyes, as my poor mother is not here." A groan burst from the stout seaman's breast, and giving way to all his feelings, he sobbed like a child. According to her desire, Leighton and Mr. Broughton retired from the room, and the young officer informed the magistrate that the prisoners who had been taken were waiting for examination at his house. "We shall want your evidence, Sir Henry," said the magistrate. "It is absolutely necessary if, as I understand, you were eye-witness to the murder." Leighton saw the propriety of the magistrate's demand, and he yielded immediately, but the investigation was prolonged by several circumstances, and, what between the time that it took up and that which had been previously spent in the pursuit of the murderers, it was past 3 o'clock before Leighton mounted his horse at Mr. Broughton's door. He paused for an instant at the gate of the Harrises' farmyard, where a girl was standing with tears in her eyes, but before he could ask any question she replied to that which was rising to his lips. "She is gone, sir," said the girl. "She is gone. She did not last half an hour after you were here." With a sad heart Leighton rose on, passing at a quick pace through Harborne Wood, and not trusting himself to stop at Mrs. Clare's cottage. The windows, however, were closed, and the young officer concluded from that circumstance that the tidings of her daughter's fate must by this time have reached the childless widow. Not far behind her gate he was met by Sir Edward Digby's servant, but eager to arrive at Woodchurch, Leighton did not stop to speak with him, and Summers, turning his horse with the orderly and his old companion, Leighton's servant, gleaned what information he could from them as he went. Notwithstanding all the speed he could use, however, it was past 4 before Leighton reached Woodchurch, and on inquiring for Mr. Ward he found that gentleman had called but gone away again, saying he would return in an hour. End of chapter 9. Volume 3, Chapter 10 of The Smuggler by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Such as we have described in the last chapter were the fatal events to which Sir Edward Digby had alluded in the few words he had spoken to Zachary Croyland, and it may be needless to explain to the reader that he had learned the tale from his servant just before he came down to dinner. Sir Robert Croyland, as we have shown, after some agitation and hesitation, quitted the drawing-room to meet, the first time for many years, the son of a man whom, at the instigation of others, he had cruelly persecuted. He paused as soon as he got into the passage, however, to summon courage, and to make up his mind as to the demeanour which he should assume, always a vain and fruitless task, for seldom, if ever, do circumstances allow any man to maintain the aspect which he has predetermined to affect. Sir Robert Croyland resolved to be cold, stately, and repulsive, to treat Sir Henry Leighton as a perfect stranger, and if he alluded to their former intimacy, to cut the conversation short by telling him that, as all the feelings of those days were at an end, he did not wish to revive their memory in any shape. He did not calculate, indeed, upon the peculiar state of Leighton's mind at the moment, nay, nor even upon the effect of his former favourite's personal appearance upon himself. And when he entered the library and saw the tall, powerful, dignified-looking man, the pale, thoughtful, stern countenance, and the haughty air, he felt all his predeterminations vain. Leighton, on his part, had done the same as Sir Robert Croyland, and in setting out from Woodchurch had made up his mind to see in the man he went to visit nothing but Edith's father, to treat him kindly, gently, and with compassion for his weakness, rather than anger at his faults. But as he rode along and conversed with one who accompanied him thither, the memory of much that Sir Robert Croyland had done in former days came painfully back upon him, and combining with his treatment of Edith, raised up bitter and indignant feelings that he could have wished to quell. The scenes which he had passed through that day, too, had given a note of sternness to his mind which was not usual, and the few minutes he had waited in the library, when every moment seemed of value, added impatience to his other sensations. The baronet entered as firmly as he could, bowing his head and motioning coldly to a chair. But Leighton did not sit down, gazing for an instant on the countenance of Sir Robert, struck and astonished by the change that he beheld. That steadfast gaze was painful to its object, and sank his spirit still farther. But Leighton, the moment after, began to speak, and the well-known tones of his clear, mellow voice awakened the recollection of the days when they were once pleasant to hear. "Sir Robert Croyland," he said, "I have come to you on business of importance, in which it is necessary for you to act immediately in your magisterial capacity." "I have no clerk with me, sir," answered the baronet in a hesitating manner. "At this late hour it is not usual, except under circumstances." "The circumstances admit of no delay, Sir Robert Croyland," replied Leighton. "As the nearest magistrate, I have applied to you in the first instance, and have done so for many other reasons besides your being the nearest magistrate." "Well, sir, what is your application?" demanded Edith's father. "I wish, indeed, you had applied to somebody else at this time of night, but I will do my duty. Oh, yes, I will do my duty." "That is all that is required, sir," answered the young officer. "My application is for a warrant to search the house of one Richard Radford, and I have to tender you on oath information that customable goods, which have been introduced without the payment of duty, are concealed on his premises. One moment more, if you please. I have also to apply to you, upon similar evidence, for a warrant to search his house for his son, Richard Radford, charged with murder, and, in the end, if you would allow me to advise you, you would instantly mount your horse and superintend the search yourself." There was a marked and peculiar emphasis on the last few words, which Sir Robert Croyland did not understand. The manner was not agreeable to him, but it was scarcely perhaps to be expected that it should be, for there had been nothing in his own to invite that kindly candour which opens heart to heart. All that had of late years passed between him and Sir Henry Leighton had been of a repulsive kind. For one youthful error, he had not only repelled and shut his house against the son, but he had persecuted, ruined, and destroyed the father, who had no part in that fault. Every reason, too, which he had given, every motive he had assigned, for his anger at Henry Leighton's pretensions to Edith's hand, he had set at naught, or forgotten in the case of him whom he had chosen for her husband. Even now, although his manner was wavering and timid, it was cold and harsh, and it was a hard thing for Henry Leighton to assume the tone of kindness towards Sir Robert Croyland, or to soften his demeanour towards him, with all the busy memories of the past and the feelings of the present thronging upon him, on his first return to the house where he had spent many happy days in youth. I am painting a man, and nothing more, and he could not, and did not, overcome the sensations of human nature. His words did not please Sir Robert Croyland, but they somewhat alarmed him. Everything that was vague in his present situation did produce fear, but after a moment's thought he replied coldly, "Oh dear, no, sir, I do not see that it is at all necessary I should go myself. I really think the application altogether extraordinary, seeing that it comes from, I am led to imagine, the Lieutenant-Colonel commanding the Regiment of dragoons, quartered in this district, who has no primary power or authority, or even duty in such affairs, but can only act as required by the officers of customs, to whom he is so far subordinate. But still I am ready to receive the informations tendered, and then shall decide in regard to my own conduct, as the case may require." "You are wrong in all respects but one, Sir Robert Croyland," answered Leighton at once. "I am empowered to act very differently from any officer who has been in command here before me. If my powers are beyond that which the law authorises, those who gave them are responsible to their country. But for an extraordinary case, extraordinary means are requisite, and as I require of you nothing but what the law requires, I shall not pause to argue whether I am exactly the proper person to make the application. It might easily be made by another who is without, but I have reasons for what I am doing, and reasons, believe me," he added, after a moment's pause and reflection, "not unfriendly to Sir Robert Croyland." Again his words and manner were peculiar. Sir Robert Croyland began to feel some apprehension lest he might push his coldness too far, but he did not see how he could change his tone, and he was proceeding, with the same distant reserve, to repeat that he was ready to receive the information in a formal manner, when Leighton suddenly interrupted him after a severe struggle with himself. "Sir Robert Croyland," he said, "let us speak as friends. Let griefs and complaints on both sides be forgotten for the moment. Let us bury for the time 7 years in oblivion. Look upon me, if it be but for a few minutes, as the Henry Leighton you knew before anything arose to produce one ill feeling between us. For believe me, I come to you with kindly sentiments. Your own fate hangs in the balance at this hour. I would decide it favourably for you, if you would let me. But you must shake off doubt and timidity. You must act boldly and decidedly, and all will be well." "I do not understand what you mean, sir," cried Sir Robert Croyland, astonished at his change of tone, and without time to collect his ideas and calculate the probabilities. "My fate! How can you affect my fate?" "More than you are aware," answered Leighton. "Even now I affect your fate by giving you the choice of at once proceeding in the line of your duty against a bad man who has overruled your better nature too long, by allowing you to conduct the search, which must be instituted either by yourself or others. In one word, Sir Robert Croyland, I know all, and would serve you if you would let me." "You know all!" exclaimed Edith's father, in a dull, gloomy tone. "You know all! She has told you, then? That explains it. That shows how she retracted her consent, how she was willing today to sacrifice her father. You have seen her. You have taught her her part. Yes, she has betrayed her parents' confidence." Leighton could bear no more. Himself he could have heard slandered calmly, but he could not hear such words of her he loved. "It is false," he said. "She did not betray your confidence. She told me no more than was needful to induce me to release her from bonds she was too faithful and true to break. From her I have heard nothing more, but from others I have heard all. And now, Sir Robert Croyland, you have chosen your part, but I have to call in those who must lay the required information. Our duty must be done, whatever be the consequences, and as you reject the only means of saving yourself from much grief, though I trust not the danger you apprehend, we must act without you." And he rose and walked towards the door. "Stay, Leighton, stay," cried Sir Robert Croyland, catching him eagerly by the arm. "Yet a moment, yet a moment. You say you know all. Do you know all? All? Everything?" "All, everything," answered Leighton firmly. "Every word that was spoken, every deed that was done, more than you know yourself." "Then, at least, you know I am innocent," said the old man. A calm but grave serenity took the place, on Sir Henry Leighton's countenance, of the impetuous look with which he had last spoken. "Innocent," he said, "of intentional murder, but not innocent of rash and unnecessary anger. And oh, Sir Robert Croyland, if I must say it, most culpable in the consequences which you have suffered to flow from one hasty act. Mark me, you see the result. Your own dear child, against your will, is in the hands of a man whom you hate and abhor. You are anxious to make her the wife of a being you condemn and despise. The child of the man that your own hand slew is now lying a corpse, murdered by him to whom you would give your daughter. Your own life is—" "What, Kate? Kate Clare?" exclaimed Sir Robert Croyland, with a sudden change coming over his countenance. "Murdered by Richard Radford? By his own hand, after the most brutal usage," replied Leighton. Sir Robert Croyland sprang to the bell and rang it violently, then threw open the door and called aloud, "My horse! My horse! Saddle my horse! If it cost me land and living, life and honour, she shall be avenged," he added, turning to Leighton, and raising his head erect, the first time for many years. "It is over. The folly and the weakness and crime are at an end. I have been bowed and broken, but there is a spark of my former nature yet left. I vowed to God in heaven that I would ever protect and be a father to that child, as an atonement, as some compensation, however small, and I will keep my vow." "Oh, Sir Robert," cried Leighton, taking his hand and pressing it in his, "be ever thus, and how men will love and venerate you." The barrier was broken down, the chain which had so long bound him was cast away, and Sir Robert returned Leighton's grasp with equal warmth. "Harry," he said, "I have done you wrong, but I will do so no more. I was goaded along the road to all evil, like a beast driven to the slaughter. But you have done wrong too, young man. Yours was the first offence." "It was," answered Leighton. "I own it. I did do wrong, and I will make no excuse, though youth, and love as true as ever man felt, might afford some. But let me assure you that I have been willing to make reparation. I have been willing to sacrifice all the brightest hope of years to save you, even now. I assured Edith that I would, when she told me the little she could venture to tell. But it was her misery that withheld me. It was the lifelong wretchedness to which she was doomed if I yielded, that made me resist. Nothing else on earth should have stopped me. But now, Sir Robert, the prospect is more clear for you." "Nay, do not speak of that," replied Sir Robert Croyland. "I will think of it no more. I have now chosen my path, and I will pursue it, without looking at the consequences to myself. Let them come when they must, for once in life I will do what is just and right." "And by so doing, my dear sir, you will save yourself," answered Leighton, moved by revenge, with no doubt whatsoever of his motive. "After a concealment of 6 years, this base man's accusation will be utterly valueless. Your bare statement of the real circumstances will be enough to dissipate every cloud. I shall require that all his papers be seized, and I have many just reasons for wishing that they should be in your hands." "I understand you, Harry, and I thank you," said Sir Robert Croyland. "But with my present feelings I would not—" "You do not understand me fully, Sir Robert," replied Leighton. "I wish you only to act as you will find right, just, and honourable, and wait for the result. It will be, or I am much mistaken, more favourable to you, personally, than you imagine. Now, as you have decided on the true and upright course, let us lose no time in carrying it into execution. I will call in the men who have to lay the information, and when you have received it, I will place before you depositions which will justify the most vigorous measures against both father and son. In regard to the latter, I must act under your authority in my military capacity, as I have no civil power there. But in regard to the former, I am already called upon by the officers of the revenue to aid them in entering his house by force, and searching it thoroughly." "Call them in, Harry, call them in," replied Sir Robert Croyland. "Every man is justified by the law in apprehending a murderer, but you shall have full authority. Kate Clare! How could this have happened?" "I will explain as we ride on," answered Leighton, going to the door, and speaking to one of the servants who was standing in the hall, he added, "Desire Mr. Mole to walk in, and bring the boy with him." In another minute Mole entered the room with another man, holding by the arm the boy Ray, whom the smugglers had chosen to denominate Little Starlight. He came, apparently, unwillingly, for though ever ready for money, to spy and to inform secretly, he had a great abhorrence of being brought publicly forward, and when on coming to Mole that evening with more information, he was detained and told he must go before a magistrate, he had made every possible effort to escape. He was now somewhat surprised on being brought forward after Mole had laid the information, to find that he was not questioned upon any point affecting the smuggling transactions which had lately taken place, as the evidence upon that subject was sufficient without his testimony. But in regard to the proceedings of young Radford, and to the place where he was concealed, he was interrogated closely. It was all in vain, however. To obtain a straightforward answer from him was impossible, and though Mole repeated distinctly that the boy had casually said the murderer of poor Kate Clare had gone to his father's house, little Starlight lied and prevaricated at every word, and impudently, though not unskilfully, attempted to put another meaning on his previous admission. As time was wearing away, however, Sir Henry Layton at length interposed. "I think it is unnecessary, Sir Robert," he said, "to push this inquiry further at present. As the whole house and premises must be searched on other grounds, we shall discover the villain if he is there. Mr. Mole and I have adopted infallible means, I think, to prevent his escaping from any point of the coast, and the magistrates at every port were this evening furnished with such information that, if they act with even a moderate degree of ability, he must be taken." "Besides, sir," rejoined Mole, "the frigate has come round, and she will take care that, with this wind, not a boat big enough to carry him over shall get out. We had better set out, your worship, if you please, for if old Radford gets an inkling of what is going on, he will double upon us some way." "I am quite ready," said Sir Robert Croyland. "I will call my clerk to accompany us as we go, in case of any further proceedings being necessary. We must pass through the village where he lives." With a firm step he moved towards the door, and, strange as it may seem, though for 6 years, while supposing he was taking the only means of self-preservation, he had lived in constant terror and anxiety, he felt no fear, no trepidation now, when he had determined to do what was right at every personal risk. An enfeebling spell seemed to have been taken off his mind, and the lassitude of doubt and indecision was gone. But such is almost always the result, even upon the nerves of our corporeal frame, of a strong effort of mental energy. It is one thing, certainly, to resolve, and another to do, but the very act of resolution, if it be sincerely exerted, affords a greater degree of vigour, which is sure to produce as great results as the means at our disposal can accomplish. Energetic determination will carry men through things that seem impossible, as a bold heart will carry them over the Alps, that, viewed from their base, appear insurmountable. Sir Robert Croyland did not venture into the drawing-room before he went, but he told the butler, who was waiting in the hall, to inform Sir Edward Digby and the family that he had been called away on business, and feared he should not return till a late hour, and having left this message, he went out upon the terrace. He found there a number of persons assembled, with some 20 or 30 of the dragoons. 5 or 6 officers of the customs were present, besides Mole, but the darkness was too great to admit of their faces being seen, and Sir Robert Croyland mounted without speaking to anyone. Sir Henry Layton paused for an instant to give orders that the boy should be taken back to Woodchurch, and kept there under a safe guard. He then spoke a few words to Digby's servant, Summers, and springing on his horse, placed himself at Sir Robert Croyland's side. The night was as dark as either of the two which had preceded it. The same film of cloud covered the sky. Not a star was to be seen. The moon was far below the horizon, and slowly the whole party moved on, 2 and 2 abreast, through the narrow lanes and tortuous roads of that part of the country. It halted for a minute in the nearest village, while Sir Robert Croyland stopped at his clerk's house, and directed him to follow as fast as possible to Mr. Radford's. And then, resuming their march, the dragoons and those who accompanied them wound on for between 4 or 5 miles further, when, as they turned the angle of a wood, some lights, apparently proceeding from the windows of a house halfway up a gentle slope, were seen shining out in the midst of the darkness. "Halt!" said Sir Henry Layton, and before he proceeded to give his orders for effectually surrounding the house and grounds of Mr. Radford, he gazed steadfastly for a moment or two upon the building which contained her who was most dear to him, and whose heart he knew well was at that moment wrung with the contention of many a painful feeling. "I promised her I would bring her aid, dear girl," he thought, "and so I have, thanks be to God, who has enabled me." Sir Robert Croyland, too, gazed with very different feelings, it is true, but still with a stern determination that was not shaken in the least. It seemed, when he thought of Kate Clare, that he was atoning to the spirit of the father by seeking to avenge the child, and the whole tale of her wrongs and death, which he had heard from Leighton as they came, had raised the desire of so doing almost to an enthusiasm. Human passions and infirmities, indeed, will mingle with our best feelings, and as he gazed upon Mr. Radford's house and remembered all that he had endured for the last 6 years, he said to himself with some bitterness, "That man shall now taste a portion of the same cup he has forced upon others." Sir Henry Leighton woke from his reverie sooner than his companion, and turning his horse he spoke for a few moments with Mole, somewhat longer with another person wrapped in a dark horseman's coat behind, and then gave various distinct orders to the dragoons, who immediately separated into small parties, and taking different roads, placed themselves in such positions as to command every approach to the house. Then riding forward with Sir Robert Croyland, the officers of customs, and 1 or 2 soldiers, he turned up the little avenue which led from the road, consulting with Edith's father as he went. At about a couple of 100 yards from the house he paused, turning his head and saying to Mole, "You had better, I think, all dismount, and making fast the horses, get behind the nearest laurels and evergreens, while Sir Robert and I ride on alone, and ask admission quietly. When the door is opened you can come up and make yourself masters of the servants till the search is over. I do not anticipate any resistance, but if the young man be really here, it may be made." He then rode on with the baronet at a quicker pace, the noise of their horses' feet as they trotted on and approached the great doors, covering the sound of the movements of the party they left behind. The house, to which the actual possessor had given the name of Radford Hall, was an old-fashioned country mansion, and presented, like many another building at that time, several large iron hooks standing out from the brickwork on each side of the doorway, on which it was customary for visitors on horseback to hang their rein while they rang the bell, or till a servant could be called to take them to the stable. Sir Robert Croyland was acquainted with this peculiarity of the house, though Leighton was not, and he whispered to his companion, "Let us hook up our horses before we ring." This was accordingly done, and then taking the long iron handle of the bell, Leighton pulled it gently. A minute or 2 after, a step sounded in the hall, and a servant appeared, a stout, red-faced, shrewd-looking fellow, who at first held the great door only half open. As soon, however, as he saw Sir Robert Croyland's face, he threw it back, replying in an answer to the baronet's question as to whether Mr. Radford was home, "Yes, Sir Robert, he has been home this hour." Leighton had stood back, and in the darkness the man did not see him, or took him for a groom, but when the young officer advanced and the uniform of the dragoon regiment became apparent, Mr. Radford's servant suddenly stretched his hand towards the door again, as if about to throw it violently to, but Leighton's strong grasp was on his shoulder in a moment. "You are my prisoner," he said in a low tone. "Not a word, not a syllable, if you would not suffer for it. No harm will happen to you if you are only quiet." At the same moment Mole and the rest came running across the lawn, and giving the man into their hands, Leighton entered the house with Sir Robert Croyland. End of chapter 10. Volume 3, Chapter 11 of The Smuggler, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. About an hour before the event took place which we have last related, Edith Croyland sat in a small drawing-room at the back of Mr. Radford's house, in which she had been kept captive, for we may well use that term, ever since her removal from Mr. Croyland's. Her first day had been spent in tears and indignation, for immediately after her arrival, on finding that her father was not really there, she became convinced that she had been deceived, and naturally doubted that it was with his consent she had been removed. Nor had Mr. Radford's manner at all tended to do away with this impression. He laughed at her remonstrances and indignation, treated her tears with cold indifference, and told his servants, before her face, that she was on no account to be suffered to go out, or to see anyone but Sir Robert Croyland. In other respects he treated her well, did all in his power to provide for her comfort, and, as his whole establishment was arranged upon a scale of luxury and extravagance rarely met with in the old country houses of the gentry of that time, none of the materials of that which is commonly called comfort were wanting. But it was the comfort of the heart which Edith required and did not find. Mr. Radford handed her down to dinner himself, and with as much ceremonious politeness as he could show, seated her at the end of his ostentatious table. But Edith did not eat. She retired at night to the downy bed prepared for her, but Edith did not sleep. Thus passed the first day and the morning of the second, and when, about noon, Sir Robert Croyland arrived, he found her pale and wan with anxiety and watching, and he left her paler still, for he resisted all her entreaties to take her thence, and her last hope of relief was gone. He had spoken kindly, tenderly indeed. He had even shed tears, but his mind at the time of his visit was still in a state of suspense. Irritated by injuries and insult, but not yet roused by indignation to dare the worst that Mr. Radford could do. And though he had heard her express her determination never to marry Richard Radford, unless set free from her vows to Henry Layton, without remonstrance, only begging her to keep that resolution secret till the last moment, yet, with the usual resource of weakness, he sought to postpone the evil hour by seeming to enter into all his enemy's views. Thus had passed Edith's time, and it is unnecessary to enter into a more detailed account of her thoughts and feelings previous to the period we have mentioned, namely, 1 hour before the arrival of her father and Henry Layton at the door of the house. She was sitting then in that small back drawing-room, with her fair cheek leaning on her hand, her eyes bent down upon the table, and her mind busy with the present and the future. "It is foolish," she thought, "thus to alarm myself. No harm can happen. They dare not show me any violence, and no clergyman in England will venture to proceed with the service against my loud dissent. My uncle, and Layton too, must soon hear of this, and will interfere. I will not give way to such terrors any more." As she thus meditated, she heard a rapid step upon the great stairs, and the next moment Mr. Radford entered, booted, spurred, and dusty as from a journey, and with a heavy horsewhip in his hand. His face betrayed more agitation than she had ever seen it display. There was a deep line between his brows, as if they had been long bent into such a frown that they could not readily be smoothed again. His long upper lip was quivering with a sort of impatient vehemence that would not be restrained, and his eye was flashing, as if under the influence of some strong passion. "Well, Miss Croyland," he said, throwing his horsewhip down upon the table, and casting himself into a chair, "I hope they have made you comfortable during my absence." Edith merely bowed her head without reply. "Well, that's civil," cried Mr. Radford, "but I think everybody is going mad, and so it is no wonder that women do. Miss Croyland, I have a piece of news for you. There's going to be a wedding in our house to-night." Still Edith was silent, and looked towards the fire. "I tell you of the fact," continued Mr. Radford, "because it may be necessary for you to make some little preparation for your journey. I don't know whether you hear or not, but you are to be married to my son to-night. It is now 9. The clergyman and Richard will be here by 11, and the marriage will take place half an hour before 12, so you have 2 hours and a half to prepare." "You are mistaken altogether, Mr. Radford," replied Edith, in as firm a tone as she could assume. "It is not my intention to marry your son at all. I have often told you so. I now repeat it." "You do you?" exclaimed Mr. Radford, giving her a furious glance across the table. "Then I will tell you something, young woman. Your consent was given to your father, and I will have no trifling backwards and forwards. Circumstances have arisen to-day, curses be upon them all, which render it necessary that the marriage should take place 24 hours before it was first fixed, and it shall take place by " and he added a terrible oath. "You will find it will not take place, Mr. Radford," replied Edith, in the same tone as before, "for, in the first place, I never did consent. My father left me fainting without waiting to hear what I had to say, or he would not have so deceived himself." "Then he shall die the death of a felon," cried Mr. Radford, "and you yourself shall be the person to put the rope round his neck." "Whatever be the consequences, I shall be firm," replied Edith. "But at the same time, let me tell you, I do not believe you have the power you suppose. You may bring a false accusation, an accusation you know to be false, but things are never so well prepared but they are discovered at last, and so it will be in your case." "A false accusation!" exclaimed Mr. Radford vehemently. "An accusation I know to be false! I'll soon show you that, girl." And starting up from his seat, he hurried out of the room. Contrary to Edith's expectation, Mr. Radford was absent for a long time, but when he returned he had several papers in his hand, some apparently freshly written, and one which bore the yellow marks of age. His face was stern and resolute, but displayed less excitement than when he left her. He entered with a slow step, leaving the door partly open behind him, seated himself and gazed at her for a moment, then spread out the small yellow paper on the table, but held his hand tight upon the lower part, as if he feared she might snatch it up and destroy it. "There, look at that, Miss Croyland," he said. "You spoke of false accusations. Look at that, and be ashamed of bringing them yourself." Edith gave a glance towards it with a sensation of awe, but did not attempt to read it. Her eye rested upon the words, "deposition of," and upon a stain of blood at the bottom of the page, and she turned away with a shudder. "I have heard of it before," she answered, "yet every word in it may be false." "False or not false," replied Mr. Radford, "it sends your father to gaol tomorrow, and to the gallows a month after, if you do not instantly sign that," and he laid another freshly written page open before her. Edith took it in her hand and read, "I hereby consent and promise, when called upon, to marry Richard Radford, Junior, Esquire, the son of Richard Radford of Radford Hall." "You have your choice, Miss Croyland," continued her persecutor, in a low and bitter tone, "either to save your father, or to put him to death with your own hands. For I swear, but all that I hold sacred, that if you do not instantly sign that paper, aye, and fulfil its engagement, I will send off this deposition to the bench of magistrates, with the letter I have just written, giving an account of all the circumstances, and explaining how, out of weak kindness and friendship for Sir Robert Croyland, I have been prevailed upon to keep back the information until now. Do not deceive yourself and think that his fortune or his station will save him. A peer of the realm has been hanged before now for the murder of his own servant. Neither must you suppose that upon that deposition alone rests the proof of his guilt. There was other evidence given at the coroner's inquest, all bearing upon the same point, which requires but this light to be made plain. The threats your father previously used, the falsehoods he told regarding where he had been, all these things can be proved, for I have taken care to preserve that evidence." "That was like a friend, indeed," murmured Edith, "but such are the friendships of the world." "I am acting like a friend to you, Miss Croyland," rejoined Mr. Radford, apparently neither touched nor hurt by her words, "in letting you see clearly your father's situation, while I give you the opportunity of saving him if you will. Do as you please. There is the paper. Sign it if you like, but sign it quickly, for this night brings all tergiversation to an end. I will have no more of it, and 5 minutes decides your father's life or death. Do not say I do it. It is you. His pardon is before you. You have nothing to do but to put your name. If you do not, you sign his death warrant." "5 minutes," said Edith, with her heart beating violently. "Aye, 5 minutes," answered Mr. Radford, who saw from the wild look of her beautiful eyes, and the ashy paleness of her cheek and lips, how powerfully he had worked upon her. 5 minutes, no longer, and he laid his watch upon the table. Then, turning somewhat ostentatiously to a small fixed writing desk which stood near, he took up a stick of sealing wax and laid it down beside the letter he had written, as if determined not to lose a moment beyond the period he had named. Edith gazed upon the paper for an instant, agitated and trembling through her whole frame, but her eye fell upon the name of Richard Radford. His image rose up before her, recalling all the horror that she felt whenever he was in her presence. Then came the thought of Leighton, and of her vows to him yet uncancelled. Richard Radford, she said to herself. Richard Radford. Marry him. Vow that I will love him. Call God to witness, when I know I shall abhor him more and more when I love another. I cannot do it. I will not do it. And she pushed the paper from her, saying aloud, No, I will not sign it. Very well, said Mr. Radford. Very well. Your parents' blood be upon your head. And he proceeded to fold up slowly the deposition he had shown her in the letter he had written. But he stopped in the midst, and then, abandoning the calm, low tone and stern but quiet demeanour which he had lately used, he started up, striking the table violently with his hand, and exclaiming in a loud and angry tone, Wretched, miserable girl! Dare you bring upon your head the guilt of parricide? What was the curse of Cain to that? How will you bear the day of your father's trial? Ay, how bear the day of his death, the lingering agony of his imprisonment, the public shame of the court of justice, the agony of the gallows and the cord? The proud Sir Robert Croyland become the gaze of hooting boys, the spectacle of the rude multitude, expiring through his daughter's fault, by the hand of the common hangman. Ay, think of it all, for in another minute it will be too late. Once gone from my hand, this paper can never be recalled. Edith uttered a faint cry, but at the same moment a voice behind Mr. Radford said, Nor can it now, and Sir Robert Croyland himself laid his hands upon the papers. Mr. Radford turned round fiercely and was darting forward to seize them from him, but he was held back by a more powerful arm, and the baronet went on in a voice grave and sad, but firm and strong. Sir Henry Leighton, he said, I give these papers into your hand to do with exactly as you may think right, as a man of honour, a gentleman, and a respecter of the law. I ask not to hold them for one moment. Do not struggle, sir, do not struggle, cried Leighton, holding Mr. Radford fast by the collar. You are a prisoner. A prisoner? exclaimed Mr. Radford. What, in my own house? A magistrate? Anywhere, sir, answered Leighton, and for the time you are a magistrate no longer. Ho, without there, send someone in. Edith had sunk down in her seat, for she knew not whether to rejoice or grieve. The first feeling undoubtedly was joy, but the next was bitter apprehension for her father. At first she covered her eyes with her hands, for she thought to hear the terrible truth proclaimed aloud. But when she looked up, Sir Robert Croyland's face was so calm, so resolute, so unlike what it had ever appeared of late years, that fear gave way to surprise, and surprise began to verge into hope. As that bright flame arose again in her heart, she started up and cast herself upon her father's bosom, murmuring, while the tears flowed rapidly from her eyes, Are you safe? Are you safe? I know not, my dear child, replied Sir Robert Croyland, but I am now doing my duty, and that gives me strength. In the meantime a dragoon had appeared at the door, and as soon as Mr. Radford beheld him, he exclaimed, This is a base and infamous plot to defeat the ends of justice. I understand it all. The military power called in, right willingly, I have no doubt, to take away the documents which prove that felon's guilt. But this shall be bitterly repaid, and I hold you responsible, sir, for the production of these papers. Certainly, Mr. Radford, replied Leighton with a calm smile, I will be responsible, but as you object to the military power, we will hand you over to the civil. Hart, he continued, speaking to the soldier, call up Mole or Birchit, or any of the other officers, and let them bring one of the constables with them, for this is not purely a case for the customs. Then tell Sergeant Shaw to bring on his men from the back as I directed, seeing that nothing, not an inch of ground, not a shed, not a tool house, remains unexamined. Of what am I accused, sir, that you dare to pursue such a course in my house? Demanded Mr. Radford. Of murder, sir, replied Sir Henry Leighton. Murder! Exclaimed Mr. Radford, and then burst into an affected laugh. Yes, sir, replied the young officer, and you may find it not so much a jest as you suppose, for though the law, in consequence of the practices of yourself and others, has slept long ineffective, it is not dead. I say for murder, as an accessory before the fact to the armed resistance of lawful authority, in which His Majesty's subjects have been killed in the execution of their duty, and as an accessory after the fact, in harbouring and comforting the actual culprits, knowing them to be such. Mr. Radford's countenance fell, for he perceived that the matter was much more serious than he had at first supposed. He trusted, indeed, from the laxity with which the law had lately been carried into execution, that he might escape from the gravest part of the charge. But still, if Sir Henry Leighton was in a condition to prove the participation of which he accused him in the crimes that had been committed, nothing short of transportation for life could be anticipated. But he had other sources of anxiety. His wretched son he expected to present himself every minute. And well aware of the foul deed which Richard Radford had that morning perpetrated, and of his person having been recognised, he was perfectly certain that his apprehension would take place. He would have given worlds to speak for a single instant with one of his own servants, but none of them appeared, and while these thoughts were passing rapidly through his brain, the officer Birchett entered the room with a constable, and several other persons followed them in. He was startled from his reverie, however, by Sir Henry Leighton's voice demanding, "Have you brought handcuffs, constable?" "Oh, aye, sir," answered the man. "I've got the bracelets." "Good evening, Mr. Radford," said Birchett. "We have hold of you at last, I fancy." Mr. Radford was silent, and the young officer demanded, "Have you found anything else, Birchett?" "Oh, yes, sir, plenty," answered Birchett, "and besides the run goods, things enough to prove all the rest, even if we had not proof sufficient before. One of your own dragoons' swords, sir, that must have been snatched up from some poor fellow who was killed. Corporal Hart says he thinks it belonged to a man named Green." "Well, there is your prisoner," replied Leighton. "You and the constable must take care that he be properly secured. No unnecessary harshness, I beg, but you know how rescue is sometimes attempted and escape effected. You had better remove him to another room, for we must have all the papers and different articles of smuggled goods brought hither." "I protest against the whole of this proceeding," exclaimed Mr. Radford, on whom the constable was now unceremoniously fixing a pair of handcuffs, "and I beg everybody will take notice of my protest. This person, who is, I suppose, a military officer, is quite going beyond his duty and acting as if he were a civil magistrate." "I am acting under the orders and authority of a magistrate, sir," replied Sir Henry Leighton, "and according to my instructions. Dear Edith," he continued, crossing over to her and taking her hand as she still clung to her father, for all that I have described had taken place with great rapidity, "you had better go into another room till this is over. We shall have some papers to examine, and I trust another prisoner before the search is finished. Had she not better retire, Sir Robert?" But Mr. Radford raised his voice again as the constable was moving him towards the door, exclaiming, "At all events, I claim my right to witness all these extraordinary proceedings. It is most unjust and illegal for you to seize and do what you will with my private papers in my absence." "It is a very common occurrence," said Sir Henry Leighton, "in criminal cases like your own." Let him remain," said Sir Robert Croyland. "He can but interrupt us a little. Oh, here is the clerk at last. Now, Edith, my love, you had better go. These are no scenes for you." Leighton took her by the hand and led her to the door, bending down his head and whispering as he went, "Be under no alarm, dear girl. All will go well." "Are you sure, Harry? Are you sure?" asked Edith, gazing anxiously in his face. "Certain," he replied. "Your father's decision has saved him." As he spoke, there was a violent ringing at the bell, and Mr. Radford said to himself, "It is that unhappy boy. He will be taken to a certainty." But the next instant he thought, No, he would never come to the front door. It must be some more of their party. Sir Robert Croyland, in the meantime, seated himself at the end of the table, and handed over a number of papers which Leighton had given him at his own house to the clerk, who, by his direction, seated himself near. "I have no objection, Mr. Radford," he said, turning to the prisoner, "that you should hear read, if you desire it, the depositions on which I have granted a warrant for your apprehension, and, at the requisition of the officers of customs, have authorised your premises to be searched for the smuggled goods, a part of which has been found upon them. The depositions are those of a man named George Jones, since dead, and of Michael Scalesby and Edward Larchant, at present in the hands of justice, and the information is laid by John Mole and Stephen Birchett." At the recital of the names of several of the men whom he himself had furnished with arms and directions, Mr. Radford's heart sank, but the moment after, a gleam of bitter satisfaction sprang up in his breast as the door opened, and Mr. Zachary Croyland entered, exclaiming, "How's this? How's this? I came to take a dove out of a hawk's nest, and here I find the dogs unearthing a fox." "I'm very glad you are come, sir," replied Mr. Radford, before anyone else could speak, "for though you are the brother of that person sitting there, you are a man of honour, and an honest man." "More than I can say for you, Radford," grumbled Mr. Croyland. "And, moreover, a magistrate for this county," continued Mr. Radford. I never act," cried the old gentleman. "I never have acted, and never will act." "But in this case I shall insist upon your acting," said the prisoner, "for your brother, who is now proceeding thus virulently against me, does it to shield himself from a charge of murder, which he knew I was about to bring against him." "Fiddlestick's ends!" cried Mr. Croyland. "This is what people call turning the tables, I think, but it won't succeed with me, my good friend. I'm an old bird, a very old bird indeed, and I don't like chaff at all, Radford. If you have any charge to make against my brother, you must make it where you are going. I'll have nothing to do with it. I always knew him to be a fool, but never suspected him of being anything else." "At all events," said Mr. Radford in a gloomy tone, "since simple justice is denied me at all hands, I require that the papers which have been seized in this house be placed in proper hands and duly authenticated. The important evidence of the crime of which I charge him has been given by your brother, sir, to one who has but too great an interest, I believe, to conceal or destroy it. I say it boldly, those papers are not safe in the keeping of Sir Henry Leighton, and I demand that they be given up, duly marked by the clerk, and signed by myself and some independent person." Leighton's eyes flashed for a moment at the insinuation which the prisoner threw out, but he overcame his anger instantly, and took the papers which had been handed him from his pocket, saying, "I will most willingly resign these documents, whatever they may be. Mr. Croyland, this person seems to wish that you should keep them, rather than myself, but here is another paper on the table which may throw some light upon the whole transaction." And he took up the written promise which Mr. Radford had been urging Edith to sign, and on which his own eyes had been fixed during the last few minutes, and handed it with the rest to her uncle. Stay a moment," said Mr. Croyland, putting on his spectacles. "I will be responsible for the safekeeping of nothing of which I do not know the contents." And he proceeded to read aloud the engagement to wed Richard Radford, which Edith had rejected. "Ay, a precious rascally document indeed," said the old gentleman, when he had concluded, "written in the hand of the said Richard Radford, Esquire, senior, and which, I suppose, Miss Croyland refused to sign under any threats. Be so good as to put your name on that at the back, Mr. Clerk. I will mark it too, that there be no mistake." "And now, sir, since you have read the one, will you be good enough to read the other?" exclaimed Mr. Radford with a triumphant smile. "Even-handed justice, if you please, Mr. Zachary Croyland. The enclosure first, then the letter, if you will. I see there are a multitude of persons present. I beg they will all attend." "I will read it, certainly," replied Mr. Croyland, drawing one of the candles somewhat nearer. "It seems to be somewhat indistinct." Sir Robert Croyland leaned his head upon his hand and covered his eyes, and several persons pressed forward to hear what seemed of importance, in the eyes of the prisoner at least. Mr. Croyland ran over the writing as a preliminary to reading it aloud, but as he did so his countenance fell and he paused and hesitated. The next moment, however, he exclaimed, "No, hang it! It shall be read. The deposition of William Clare, now lying at the point of death, and with the full assurance that he has not many minutes to live, made before Richard Radford, Esquire, J.P., this 24th day of September, in the year of grace 17 —," and he proceeded to read, with a voice occasionally wavering indeed, but in general firm and clear, the formal setting forth of the same tale which the reader has heard before, in the statement of Sir Robert Croyland to his daughter. His brother paused and held the paper in his hand for a moment after he had done, while Leighton, who had been standing close beside him, bore a strange, almost sarcastic smile upon his lip, which strongly contrasted with the sad and solemn expression of Mr. Croyland's countenance. "What is this great red blot just below the man's name?" asked the old gentleman at length, looking to Mr. Radford. "That, sir," replied the prisoner in a calm, grave tone, which had much effect upon his hearers, "is the poor fellow's own blood, as I held him up to sign the declaration. He had been pressing his right hand upon the wound, and where it rested on the paper it gave that bloody witness to the authenticity of the document." There was something too fine in the reply, and Mr. Croyland repeated, "Bloody witness, authenticity of the document." But Leighton stretched out his hand, saying, "Will you allow me to look at the paper, Mr. Croyland?" and then added, as soon as he had received it, "Can anyone tell me whether William Clare was left-handed?" "No," said Sir Robert Croyland, suddenly raising his head. "No, he was not. Why do you ask?" "That I can answer for," said the constable, coming forward, "for he carved the stock of a gun for me, and I know he never used his left hand when he could use his right one." "Why do you ask, Harry? Why do you ask?" exclaimed Mr. Croyland. "Because, my dear sir," answered Leighton, aloud and clear, "this is the print of the thumb of a man's right hand. To have made it at all, he must have held the paper with his right, while he signed with his left, and even then he could have done it with difficulty, as it is so near the signature that his fingers would not have room to move." And as he ended, he fixed his eyes sternly on Mr. Radford's face. The prisoner's countenance had changed several times while Sir Henry Leighton spoke, first becoming fiery red, then deadly pale, then red again. "However it happened, so it was," he said doggedly. "Well," exclaimed Mr. Croyland sharply, "your evidence will fetch what it is worth. I hope, clerk, you have got down Mr. Radford's statement?" "He has written the same down here, your worship," replied the man, pointing to the letter in which the deposition had been enclosed, and which, having been cast down by Mr. Zachary, had been busily read by the clerk. "Well, then, we will read that too," observed the old gentleman. "Silence there," he continued, for there was a good deal of noise at the side of the room, as the different persons present conversed over the events that were passing. "But first we had better docket this commodity which we have just perused. Mr. Clerk, will you have the goodness to sign it also on the back?" "Stay," said a voice from behind the rest, "let me sign it first." And the man who had accompanied Leighton thither, wrapped in the dark horseman's coat, advanced between Mr. Croyland and the clerk. Any one that likes," answered the former. "Aye, is that you, my old friend?" Both Mr. Radford and Sir Robert Croyland gazed, with looks of surprise not unmingled with more painful feelings, on the countenance of Mr. Ward, though each doubted his identity with one whom they had known in former years. But without noticing any more, the strange-looking old man took the paper from the clerk, dipped the pen in the ink, and in a bold, free hand wrote some words upon the back. "Ha! What is this?" cried Mr. Croyland, taking the paper and reading. "An infamous forgery, Henry Osborne." "Villain, you are detected," cried the person who has been called Mr. Ward. "I wrote from a distant land to warn you that I was present when you knelt by William Clare, that I heard all, that I heard you try to prompt the dying man to an accusation he would not make, that I saw you stain the paper with his blood, aye, and sign it too, after life had quitted him. I wrote to warn you, for I suspected you from all I heard of your poor tool's changed conduct, and I gave you due notice that if you ceased not, the day of retribution would arrive. It is come, and I am here, though you thought me dead. All your shifts and evasions are at an end. There is no collusion here. There is no personal interest. I have not conversed with that weak man for many years, and he it was who persecuted my sister's husband unto death." "At his suggestion, from his threats," exclaimed Sir Robert Croyland, pointing with his hand to Mr. Radford. "Take me away," said the prisoner, turning to the constable. "I am faint. I am sick. Take me away." Mr. Croyland nodded his head, and supported by the constable and Birchett, Mr. Radford was led into the adjoining room. The scene that followed is indescribable. It was all confusion. Every one spoke at once. Some strove to make themselves heard above the rest. Some seemed little to care whether they were heard or not. If any man thought he could fix another's attention, he tried to converse with him apart. Many fixed upon the person nearest, but one or two endeavoured to make others hear across the room, and all order and common form were at an end. I have said everyone spoke, but I should have made one exception. Sir Robert Croyland talked eagerly with his brother, and said a few low words to Mr. Osborne, but Leighton remained profoundly silent for several minutes. The din of many voices did not seem to disturb him, and strange turn that events had taken appeared to produce no surprise. But he remained fixed to the same spot, with his eyes bent upon the table, and his mind evidently absent from all that was passing round. It was the abstraction of profound emotion, the power which the heart sometimes exercises over the mind, in withdrawing all its perceptions and its operative faculties from external things, to fix them concentrated upon some great problem within. At length, however, a sense of higher duties made him shake off the thoughts of his own fate and situation, of the bright and glorious hopes that were rising out of the previous darkness, like the splendour of the coming star after a long night, of the dreams of love and joy at length, of the growing light of trust in the future, still faintly overshadowed by the dark objects of the past. With a quick start, as if he had awakened from sleep, he looked round and demanded of one of the soldiers, many of whom were in the room, "Have you found the person accused, Richard Radford, I mean? Has any one been taken on the premises and the house, besides the servants?" "Yes, sir, a person just arrived in a post-chaise," replied the sergeant. "We must have order, Sir Robert," continued Leighton, his powerful voice rising above the din. "There is much more to be done. Clear the room of your men, sergeant. They are not wanted here. But stay, I will speak with Mr. Haviland." And he went out, followed by the sergeant and some half-dozen of the dragoons, who had accompanied their non-commissioned officer into the room. Leighton soon returned, but the precautions he had gone to enforce were vain. The person who had arrived in the chaise proved to be a somewhat disreputable clergyman from a distant parish. Young Richard Radford was not taken. Another fate awaited him. A man, indeed, on horseback, was seen to approach the grounds of Radford Hall towards 11 o'clock, but the lights, that were apparent through many windows, seemed to startle him, as he rode along the road. He paused for a moment and gazed, and then advanced more slowly, but the eagerness of the small guard at that point, perhaps, frustrated their object, for it was not certain to this day who the person was. When he again halted and seemed to hesitate, they dashed out after him, but instantly setting spurs to his horse he galloped off into the woods, and knowing the country better than they did, he was soon lost to their pursuit. In the meantime, the result of the search in Mr. Radford's house was made known, in a formal manner, to the party assembled in the small drawing-room. Abundant evidence was found of his having been implicated in all the most criminal parts of the late smuggling transactions, and the business of the night concluded by an order to remand him to be brought before the bench of magistrates on the following day, for Sir Robert Croyland declined to commit him on his own responsibility. "He has preferred a charge against me," he said, in the same firm tone he had lately assumed. "Let us see whether he will sustain it to-morrow." Before all was concluded, it was near midnight, and then everyone rose to depart. Mr. Croyland eagerly asked for Edith, saying he would convey her home in his carriage, but Leighton interposed, replying, "We will bring her to you in a moment, my dear friend. Sir Robert, it may be as well that you and I should seek Miss Croyland alone. I think I saw her maid below." "Certainly," answered the father. "Let us go, my dear Henry, for it is growing very late." Mr. Croyland smiled, saying, "Well, well, so be it," and the other two left the room. They found Edith, after some search, seated in the dining-hall. She looked pale and anxious, but the expression of Leighton's face relieved her of her worst apprehensions. Not that it was joyful, for there was a touch of sadness in it, but she knew that his aspect could not be such if her father's life were in any real danger. Leighton advanced towards her at once, even before her father, took her hand in his, and kissed it tenderly. "I told you, dearest Edith," he said, "that I would bring you aid, and I have, thank God, been able to redeem that promise. But now I have another task to perform. Your father's safety is placed beyond doubt, his innocence made clear, and your happiness, beloved one, is not sacrificed. The chance of endangering that happiness was the only cause of my not doing what, perhaps, you desired for his sake, what I do now. Sir Robert Croyland, I did wrong in years long past, in boyhood and the intemperance of youthful love and hope, by engaging your daughter to myself by vows which she has nobly, though painfully, kept. As an atonement to you, as a satisfaction to my own sense of right, I now, as far as in me lies, set her free from those engagements, leaving to her own self how she will act, and to you how you will decide. Edith, beloved, you are free, as far as I can make you so. And Sir Robert, I ask your forgiveness for the wrong act I once committed." Edith Croyland turned somewhat pale, and looked at her father earnestly, but Sir Robert did not answer for a moment. Was it that he hesitated? No, there was an oppressive weight at his heart when he thought of all that he had done, all that he had inflicted, not only on the man before him, but on other guiltless of all offence, which seemed almost to stop its beating. But at length he took Edith's hand and put it in Leighton's, saying, in a low, tremulous voice, "She is yours, Henry, she is yours, and oh, forgive the father for the daughter's sake." End of chapter 11. Volume 3, Chapter 12 of The Smuggler by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. There was a solitary light in an upstairs window of Farmer Harris's house, and by its dim ray sat Harding the smuggler, watching the inanimate form of her upon whom all the strong affections of his heart had been concentrated. No persuasions could induce him to entrust the first watch, as he called it, to others, and there he sat, seldom taking his eyes from that pale but still beautiful countenance, and often stooping over to print a kiss upon the cold and clay-like forehead of the dead. His tears were all shed. He wept not, he spoke not, but the bitterness which has no end was in his heart, and with a sleepless eye he watched through the livelong night. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning when a hard knocking was heard at the door of the farm, and without a change of feature Harding rose and went down in the dark. He unlocked the door and opened it, when a hand holding a paper was thrust in and instantly withdrawn, as Harding took the letter. "What is this?" he said, but the messenger ran away without reply, and the smuggler returned to the chamber of death. The paper he had taken was folded in the shape of a note, but neither sealed nor addressed, and without ceremony Harding opened it and read. It was written in a free, good hand, which he recognised at once, with rage and indignation all the more intense because he restrained them within his own breast. He uttered not a word. His face betrayed only in part the workings of strong passion within him. It is true his lip quivered a little, and his brow became contracted, but it soon relaxed its frown, and without oath or comment, though very blasphemous expletives were then tolerated in what was called the best society, and were prevalent amongst all the inferior classes, he proceeded to read the few lines which the letter contained, and which something, perhaps the emotions he felt, had prevented him from seeing distinctly at first. The epistle was, as we have seen, addressed to no one, and was drawn up, indeed, more in the form of a general notice than anything else. Many of nearly the same import, as was afterwards discovered, had been delivered at various farmhouses in the neighbourhood, but as all were in substance the same, one specimen will suffice. "We give you to know," so the letter ran, "that unless Edward Ramley and his 2 comrades are set free before daylight tomorrow, we will come to Goudhurst and burn the place. Neither man, woman, nor child shall escape. We are many, more than you think, and you know we will keep our word. So look to it if you would escape. Vengeance." Harding approached the bed with the letter in his hand, gazed steadfastly upon the corpse for several minutes, and then, without a word, quitted the room. He went straight to the chamber which Farmer Harris and his wife now occupied, and knocked sharply at the door, exclaiming, "Harris, Harris, I want to speak with you." The good farmer was with difficulty roused, for though no man felt more warmly, or indeed more vehemently, yet the corporeal had its full share with the mental, and when the body was fatigued with more than its ordinary portion of labour, the mind did not keep the whole being waking. At length, however, he came out, still drowsy, and taking the letter, gazed on it by the light of the candle, with lack-lustre eye. But Harding soon brought him to active consciousness by saying, "They threaten to burn the village, Harris, unless the murderers be suffered to escape. I'm going up to the church where they are kept. Wake someone to sit upstairs. I will die before a man of them goes out." "And so will I," cried Harris. Let me see. My heart's asleep still, but I'll soon wake up. Why, where the mischief did this come from?" And he read the letter over again, with more comprehension of its contents. When he had done, he swore vehemently. "They shall find that the men of Goudhurst can match them," he cried. "But we must set about it quick, Harding, and call up all the young men. They will come, that is certain, for the devil himself has not their impudence. But they must be well received when they do come. We'll give them a breakfast, Harding, they shan't forget. It shall be called the Goudhurst breakfast as long as men can remember. Stay, I'll just put on my coat and get out the gun and the pistols. We shall want as many of those things as we can muster. I'll be back in a minute." From that hour till 5 o'clock, the little village of Goudhurst was all alive. Intimation of the danger was sent to all the neighbouring farmers. Every labouring man was roused from his bed with directions to meet the rest in the churchyard. And there, as the sky became grey, a busy scene was displayed, some 60 stout men being assembled before the porch, most of them armed with old muskets or fowling pieces. Amongst those to whom age or habitual authority assigned the chief place, an eager consultation went on as to their proceedings, and though there was, as is generally the case in such meetings, a great difference upon many points, yet 3 acts were unanimously decided upon. First, to send all the women and children out of the village; next, to dispatch a messenger to Woodchurch for military aid; and next, to set about casting bullets immediately, as no shot larger than slugs were to be found in the place. The reader will probably ask, with a look of surprise, is this a scene in North America, where settlers were daily exposed to the incursions of the savages? And he may add, this could not have happened in England. But I beg to say, this happened in the county of Kent less than a century ago, and persons are still living who remember having been sent with the women and children out of the village, that the men might not be impeded by fear for those they loved, while defending the spot on which they were born. A fire of wood was speedily lighted by some of the men in the churchyard. Others applied themselves, with what moulds could be procured, to the casting of ball. Others again woke the still slumbering inhabitants of the cottages and houses round, and warned the women to remove to the neighbouring farms, and the men to come and join their friends at the rendezvous, and a few of the best instructed proceeded to arrange their plan of defence, barricading the gates of the cemetery, and blocking up a stile, which at that time led from the right-hand wall with an old gravestone, against which they piled up a heap of earth. The vestry in which the prisoners had been confined, after having brought from Mr. Broughton's at too late an hour to convey them to gaol, was luckily protected by strong iron bars over the windows, and a heavy plated door between it and the church, and the old tower of the building afforded a strong point in the position of the villagers, which they flattered themselves could not easily be forced. "How many men do you think they can muster, Harding?" asked Farmer Harris, when their first rude preparations were nearly complete. "I can but guess," answered the smuggler. "Perhaps 200. They had more than that in the marsh, of whom I hear some 50 were taken or killed. But a good many were not there, who may and will be here to-day. Old Ramley for one, I should think." "Then we had better get into the church when they come," replied the farmer. "They cannot force us there till the soldiers come." "Did you send for them?" asked Harding. "Oh yes," answered the farmer. "Half an hour ago. I sent the young boy who would be of no good here, on the pony, and I told him to let Sir Robert know as he passed, for I thought the soldiers might not meddle if they had not a magistrate with them." "Very well," replied Harding, and set himself to work away again. 6 o'clock was now past. 7 approached and went by. The hand of the dial moved half-way on to 8, and yet nothing indicated the approach of the smugglers. In a few minutes after, however, the sound of horses' feet galloping was heard, and a young man, who had been placed in the belfry to look out, shouted down to those below, "Only 2!" and the next moment a horseman in military half-dress, with a servant behind him, rode up at speed to the principal entrance of the churchyard. "I am come to help you, my men," cried Sir Edward Digby, springing to the ground and giving his rein to his servant. "Will you let us into your redoubt? The dragoons will soon be over. I sent your messenger on." "Perhaps, sir, you may have your trouble for your pains after all," answered young Harris, opening the gate, to let Digby and his horses in. "The fellows have not shown themselves, and very likely won't come." "Oh, yes, they will," said the young baronet, advancing amongst them and looking round on every side. "I saw a long line of men on horseback moving over the hill as I came. Put the horses under cover of that shed, Summers. You should cut down those thick bushes near the wall. They will conceal their movements. Have you any axes?" "Here is one," cried a young man, and immediately he set to work, hewing down the shrubs and bushes to which Digby pointed. In the meantime the young officer ran over the groups with his eye, calculating their numbers, and at length he said, "You had better confine yourself to defending the church. You are not enough to meet them out here. I counted 150, and there may be more. Station your best marksmen at the windows and on the roof of the tower, and put a few stout, resolute fellows to guard the door in case these scoundrels get nearer than we wish them. As we all act upon our own responsibility, however, we had better be cautious, and abstain from offensive measures till they are absolutely necessary for the defence of ourselves and the security of the prisoners. Besides, if they are kept at bay for some time, the dragoons will take them in flank, and a good number may be captured." "We can deal with them ourselves," said the voice of Harding in a stern tone. He had been standing by, listening in grave silence, with a gun in his hand, which he had borrowed at Farmer Harris's, and now, as soon as he had spoken, he turned away, walked into the church, and climbed to the roof of the tower. There, after examining the priming of the piece, he seated himself coolly upon the little parapet and looked out over the country. The moment after, his voice was heard, calling from above, "They are coming up, Harris. Tell the officer." Sir Edward Digby had, in the meantime, advanced to the gates to ensure that they were securely fastened, but he heard what Harding said, and turning his head, exclaimed, "Go into the church and garnish the windows with marksmen, as I said. I will be with you in a moment. Here, Summers, help me here for a moment. They will soon pull this down," and he proceeded calmly to fasten the barricade more strongly. Before he had accomplished this to his satisfaction, men on horseback were seen gathering thick in the road, and on the little open space in front. But he went on without pausing to look at them, till a loud voice exclaimed, "What are you about there? Do you intend to give the men up or not?" Sir Edward Digby then raised his head and replied, "Certainly not. Oh, Mr. Richard Radford, you will have the goodness to remark that, if you advance one step towards these gates, or attempt to pass that wall, you will be fired on from the church." While he was speaking, he took a step back, and then walked slowly towards the building, making his servant go first. But halfway thither he paused, and turning towards the ruffians congregated at a little distance from the wall, he added aloud, addressing Richard Radford, "You had better tell your gang what I say, my good friend, for they will find we will keep our word." As he spoke, someone from the mass fired a pistol at him, but the ball did not take effect, and Digby raised his hand, waving to those in the church not to fire, and at the same time hurrying his pace a little till he had passed the door and ordered it to be shut. "They have now fair warning," he said to one of the young Harrises who was on guard at the door, "but I will go up above and call to you when I think anything is necessary to be done. Remember, my good fellows, that some order must be kept, and as you cannot all be at the windows, let those who must stand back load while the rest fire." Thus saying, he mounted to the top of the tower with a quick step, and found Harding and 5 others on the roof. The horsemen in front of the church were all gathered together at a little distance, and seemed in eager consultation, and amongst them the figures of young Radford and the 2 Ramleys, father and son, were conspicuous from their vehement gestures that they made, now pointing to the top of the tower, now to the wall of the churchyard. "I think we could bring a good many down as they stand now," said young William Harris, moving his gun towards his shoulder, as if the inclination to fire were almost irresistible. Stay, not yet," replied Sir Edward Digby. "Let it be clearly in our own defence. Besides, you must remember these are but fowling pieces. At that distance few shots would tell." "One shall tell at least before this day is over," said Harding, who had remained seated, hardly looking at the party without. "Something tells me I shall have vengeance this day." "Hello, they are about to begin," cried another man, and the same moment the gang of miscreants spread out, and while some advanced on horseback towards the wall, at least 50, who were armed with guns, dismounted and aimed deliberately at the tower and the windows. "Down with your heads behind the parapet," cried Digby, though he did not follow the caution himself, No use of exposing your lives needlessly. Down, down, Harding. But Harding sat where he was, saying bitterly, "They'll not hit me. I know it. They've done worse already." As he spoke, a single gun was fired, and then a volley from the two sides of the churchyard wall. One of the balls whizzed close by Sir Edward Digby's head, and another struck the parapet near Harding, but neither were touched, and the stout seaman did not move a muscle. "Now up and give it them back," exclaimed Digby, and speaking down the trap that led to the stairs, he called to those below, "Fire now and pick them off. Steadily, steadily," he continued, addressing his companions on the roof, who were becoming somewhat too much excited. "Make every shot tell if you can. A good aim, a good aim." "Here goes for one," cried William Harris, aiming at Jim Ramley and hitting him in the thigh, and instantly from the roof and the windows of the church blazed forth a sharp fire of musketry, which apparently was not without severe effect, for the men who had dismounted were thrown into great confusion, and the horsemen who were advancing recoiled, with several of their horses plunging violently. The only one on the roof who did not fire was Harding, and he remained with his gun resting on the parapet beside him, gazing with a stern, dark brow upon the scene. "There are 3 down," cried one of the men, "and a lot of horses." But Richard Radford was seen gesticulating vehemently, and at length taking off his hat, he waved it in the air, shouting, so loud that his words reached those above, "I will show you the way, then. Let every brave man follow me." And as he spoke, he struck his spurs into his horse's sides, galloped on, and pushed his breast at the low wall of the churchyard. The animal, a powerful hunter, which had been sent to him by his father the day before, rose to the leap as if with pride. But just then Harding raised his gun, aimed steadily, and pulled the trigger. The smoke for a moment obscured Digby's view, but the instant after he saw Richard Radford falling headlong from the saddle, and his shoulders striking the wall as the horse cleared it. The body then fell over, bent up, with the head leaning against a tombstone and the legs upon an adjoining grave. "There, that's done," said Harding, and laying down the gun again, he betook himself quietly to his seat upon the parapet once more. "The dragoons! The dragoons!" cried a young man from the other side of the tower, but ere he spoke the gang of villains were already in retreat, several galloping away and the rest wavering. Load as fast as they could, the stout yeomanry in the church continued firing from the windows and from the roof, accelerating the movements of their assailants, who seemed only to pause for the purpose of carrying off their wounded companions. Sir Edward Digby, however, ran round to the opposite side of the tower, and, clearly seeing the advance of some cavalry from the side of Cranbrook, though the trees prevented him from ascertaining their numbers, he bade the rest follow and ran down into the body of the church. "Now out and after them," he exclaimed. "We may make some prisoners." But as soon as the large wooden doors were thrown back and the peasantry were seen pouring forth, old Ramley, who was amongst the last that lingered, turned his horse and galloped away, his companions following as fast as they could. 4 men were found on the outside of the churchyard wall, of whom 2 were living, but Sir Edward Digby advanced with several others to the spot where Richard Radford was lying. He did not appear to have moved at all since he fell, and on raising his head, which had fallen forward on his chest as he lay propped up by the gravestone, a dark red spot in the centre of his forehead, from which a small quantity of blood had flowed down over his eyes and cheeks, told how fatally true the shot had gone to the mark. When he had gazed on him for a moment, Digby turned round again to look for Harding, but the man who had slain him did not approach the corpse of Richard Radford, and Digby perceived him standing near a low shed, which at that time encumbered the churchyard of Goudhurst, and under which the young baronet's horses had been placed. Thither the strong hunter which Radford had been riding had trotted as soon as his master fell, and Harding had caught it by the bridle, and was gazing at it with a thoughtful look. The last time Sir Edward Digby had seen him before that morning, he was in high happiness by the side of poor Kate Clare, and when the young officer looked at him as he stood there, with a sort of dull despair in his whole aspect, he could not but feel strong and painful sympathy with him in his deep grief. "Mr. Harding," he said, approaching him, "the unhappy man is quite dead." "Oh yes, sir," answered Harding, "dead enough, I am sure. I hope he knew whose hand did it." I am sorry to give you any further pain or anxiety at this moment, continued Digby, sinking his voice, but I have heard that you are supposed to have taken some part in landing the goods which were captured the other day. For aught we know, there may be information lodged against you, and probably there will be some officer of customs with the troop that is coming up. Would it not be better for you to retire from this scene for a little? Thank you, sir, thank you, that is kind, answered Harding. Life's a load to me, but a prison is another thing. I would have given any of those clumsy fellows 100 guineas to have shot me as I sat there, but no man shall ever take me and clap me up in a cell. I could not bear that, and my poor Kate lying dead there too. I'll go, as you say. But before he could execute his purpose, a small party of dragoons, commanded by a lieutenant with Burchett, the riding officer, and 2 or 3 of his companions, came up at a trot and poured through the gate of the churchyard, which was now open. Sir Edward Digby advanced at once towards them, if the truth must be told, to cover Harding's retreat. But Burchett's quick, shrewd eye had run round the place in an instant, and before the young baronet had taken 2 steps along the path, he cried, "Why, there is Harding! Stop him! Stop him! We have information against him. Don't let him pass." "I will pass, though," cried Harding, leaping at once upon the back of Richard Radford's horse. "Now, stop me if you can." And striking it with his heel, he turned the animal across the churchyard, taking an angle away from the dragoons. Burchett spurred after him in a moment, and the other officers followed, but the soldiers did not move. Passing close by the spot where young Radford lay, as the officers tried to cut him off from the gate, Harding cried with a wild and bitter laugh, "He is a good leaper, I know," and instantly pushed his horse at the wall. The gallant beast took it at once, and dashed away with its rider along the road. The officers of customs dared not trust their own cattle with the same feat, but Burchett exclaimed in a loud and imperative tone, turning to the lieutenant of dragoons, "I require your aid in capturing that man. He is one of the most daring smugglers on the whole coast. We can catch him easily if we are quick." "I do not know that I am authorised," said the lieutenant, not well pleased with the man's manner, "where no armed resistance is apprehended. I doubt if—" "But there may be resistance, sir," replied Burchett vehemently. "He is gone to join his comrades. Well, the responsibility be on your head. I claim your aid. Refuse it or not, as you shall think fit. I claim and require it instantly." "What do you think, sir?" asked the young officer, turning to Digby. "Nay, I am not in command here," answered the other. "You know your orders." "To give all lawful aid and assistance," said the lieutenant. "Well, take a sergeant's guard, Mr. Burchett." In haste the men were drawn out and followed, Burchett leading them furiously in the pursuit, but ere they had quitted the churchyard, Harding was half a mile upon the road, and that was all he desired. End of chapter 12. Volume 3, Chapter 13 of The Smuggler by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. There was a large lugger lying off at no great distance from the beach, near Sandgate, and a small boat ready for launching on the shore. At the distance of 2 or 3 miles out might be seen a vessel of considerable size, and of that peculiar rig and build which denoted to nautical eyes that there lay a king's vessel. She was indeed a frigate of inferior class, which had been sent round to co-operate with the customs in the suppression of the daring system of smuggling, which, as we have shown, was carried on in Romney Marsh and the neighbouring country. By the lesser boat, upon the shore, stood 4 stout fellows, apparently employed in making ready to put off, and upon the high ground above was seen a single officer of customs, walking carelessly to and fro, and apparently taking little heed of the proceedings below. Some movements might be perceived on board the ship. The sails, which had been furled, now began to flutter in the wind, which was blowing strong, and it seemed evident that the little frigate was about to get under way. The lugger, however, remained stationary, and the men near the boat continued their labours for nearly an hour after they seemed in reality to have nothing more to do. At length, however, coming at a furious pace down one of the narrow footpaths from the high ground above, which led away towards Cheriton and Newington, was seen a horseman waving his hand to those below, and passing within 50 yards of the officers of customs. The sailors, who were standing by the boat, instantly pushed her down to the very verge of the water. The officer hallooed after the bold rider, but without causing him to pause for an instant in his course, and down at thundering speed across the road and over the sand and shingle. Harding, the smuggler, dashed on till the horse that bore him stood foaming and panting beside the boat. Instantly springing out of the saddle, he cast the bridle on the tired beast's neck and jumped into the skiff, exclaiming, "Shove her off!" "Aren't there some more, Jack?" asked one of the men. "None but myself," replied Harding, "and me they shan't catch. Shove her off, I say. You'll soon see who are coming after." The men obeyed at once. The boat was launched into the water, and almost at the same time the party of dragoons in pursuit appeared upon the top of the rise, followed a moment after by Birchett and another officer of the customs. The vehement and angry gestures of the riding officer indicated plainly enough that he saw the prey had escaped him. But while the dragoons and his fellow officer made their way slowly down the bank to the narrow road which at that time ran along the beach, he galloped off towards a signal post, which then stood upon an elevated spot, not far from the place where the turnpike, on the road between Sandgate and Folkestone, now stands. In a few minutes various small flags were seen rapidly running up to the top of the staff, and as speedily as possible afterwards signals of the same kind were displayed on board the frigate. In the meantime, however, Harding and his party had rowed rapidly towards the lugger, the sails of which were already beginning to fill, and in less than 2 minutes she was scudding through the water as fast as the wind would bear her. But the frigate was also under way, and to both experienced and inexperienced eyes it seemed that the bold smuggler had hardly one chance of escape. Between Dungeness Point and the royal vessel there appeared to be no space for any of those daring manoeuvres by which the small vessels engaged in the contraband trade occasionally eluded the pursuit of their larger and more formidable opponents. But Harding still pursued his course, striving to get into the open sea before the frigate could cut him off. Bending under the press of sail, the boat rushed through the waves, with the ebb tide running strong against her, and the spray dashing over her from stem to stern. But still, as she took an angle, though an acute one, with the course of the frigate, the latter gained upon her every moment, till at length a shot, whistling across her bows, gave her the signal to bring to. It is needless to tell the reader that signal received no attention, but, still steered with a firm hand, and carrying every stitch of canvas she could bear, the lugger pursued her way. A minute had scarcely passed ere flash and report came again from the frigate, and once more a ball whistled by. Another and another followed, but no longer directed across the lugger's bow. They were evidently aimed directly at her, and one of them passed through the foresail, though without doing any farther damage. The case seemed so hopeless, not only to those who watched the whole proceeding from the shore, but to most of those who were in the lugger, that a murmured consultation took place among the men, and after 2 or 3 more shots had been fired, coming each time nearer and nearer to their flying mark, one of the crew turned to Harding, who had scarcely uttered a word since he entered the boat, and said, "Come, sir, I don't think this will do. We shall only get ourselves sunk for no good. We had better douse." Harding looked sternly at him for a moment without reply, and a somewhat bitter answer rose to his lips, but he checked himself and said at length, "There's no use sacrificing your lives. You've got wives and children, fathers and mothers. I have no one to care for me. Get into the boat and be off. Me they shall never catch, dead or alive, and if I go to the bottom it's the best berth for me now. Here, just help me reeve these tiller ropes that I may take shelter under the companion, and then be off as fast as you can." The men would fain have remonstrated, but Harding would hear nothing, and covering himself as much as he could from the aim of small arms from the vessel, he insisted that the whole of his crew should go and leave him. A short pause in the lugger's flight was observable from the shore, and everybody concluded that she had struck. The rowboat, filled with men, was seen to pull off from her, and the large heavy sails to flap for an instant in the wind. But then her course was altered in a moment, the sails filled again with the full breeze, and going like a swallow over the waves, she dashed on towards the frigate, and passing within pistol range immediately after, shot across upon her weather bow. A cloud of smoke ran all along the side of the frigate, as this bold and extraordinary manoeuvre was executed. The faint report of small arms was wafted by the wind to the shore, as well as the sound of several cannon, but still, whether Harding was wounded or not wounded, living or dead, his gallant boat dashed steadily on, and left the frigate far behind, apparently giving up the chase as no longer presenting any chance of success. On went the lugger, diminishing as it flew over the waves, till at length, to the eyes even of those who watched from the heights, its dark tan sails grouped themselves into one small speck, and were then lost to the sight. The after-fate of that adventurous man who thus, single and unaided, trusted himself to the wide waves, is wrapped in obscurity. The writer of these pages, indeed, did once see a stern-looking old man of the same name, who had returned some few years before from distant lands, no one well knew whence, to spend the last few years of a life which had been protracted considerably beyond the ordinary term of human existence, in a seaport not very far from Folkestone. The conversation of the people of the place pointed him out as one who had done extraordinary deeds and seen strange sights, but whether he was indeed the Harding of this tale or not, I cannot say. Of one thing, however, the reader may be certain, that in all the statements regarding the smuggler's marvellous escape, the most scrupulous accuracy has been observed, and that every fact is as true as any part of history, and a great deal more so than most. Having now disposed of one of our principal characters, let me take the reader gently by the hand and lead him back to Harborne House. The way is somewhat long, but still not more than a stout man can walk without fatigue upon a pleasant morning, and it lies, too, amongst sweet and interesting scenes, which, to you and me, dear reader, are, I trust, embellished by some of the charms of association. It was about 6 days after the attack upon the church at Goudhurst, when a great number of those personages with whom it has been necessary to make the reader acquainted were assembled in the drawing-room of Sir Robert Croyland's mansion. One or two, indeed, were wanting, even of the party which might have been expected there, but their absence shall be accounted for hereafter. The baronet himself was seated in the armchair, which he generally occupied more as a mark of his state and dignity than for comfort and convenience. In the present instance, however, he seemed to need support, for he leaned heavily upon the arm of the chair, and appeared languid and feeble. His face was very pale, his lips somewhat livid, and yet, though suffering evidently under considerable corporeal debility, there was a look of mental relief in his eyes, and a sweet placidity about his smile, that no one had seen on his countenance for many years. Mrs. Barbara was, as usual, seated at her everlasting embroidery, and here we may as well mention a fact which we omitted to mention before, but which some persons may look upon as indicative of her mental character, namely, that the embroidery, though it had gone on all her life, by no means proceeded in an even course of progression. On the contrary, to inexperienced eyes, it seemed as if no sooner was a stitch put in than it was drawn out again, the point of the needle being gently thrust under the loop of the thread, and then the arm extended with an even sweep so as to withdraw the silk from its hole in the canvas. Penelope's web was nothing to Mrs. Barbara Croyland's embroidery, for the Queen of Ithaca only undid what she had previously done every night, and Aunt Bab undid it every minute. On the present occasion she was more busy in the retroactive process than ever, not only pulling out the silk she had just put in, but a great deal more, so that the work of the last 3 days was in imminent danger of total destruction. Mr. Zachary Croyland never sat down when he could stand, for there was about him a sort of mobility and activity of spirits which always inclined him to keep his body ready for action. He so well knew that, when seated, he was incessantly inclined to start up again, that probably he thought it of little use to sit down at all, and consequently he was even now upon his feet, midway between his brother and his sister, rubbing his hands and giving a gay but cynical glance from one to the other. In a chair near the window, with his wild but fine eyes gazing over the pleasant prospect which the terrace commanded, and apparently altogether absent in mind from the scene in the drawing-room, was seated Mr. Osborne, and not far from Mr. Croyland stood Sir Henry Layton, in an ordinary riding dress, with his left hand resting on the hilt of his sword, speaking in an easy, quiet tone to Sir Robert Croyland. And nearly opposite to him was Edith, with her arm resting on the table, and her cheek supported on her hand. Her face was still pale, though the colour had somewhat returned, and the expression was grave, though calm. Indeed, she never recovered the gay and sparkling look which had characterised her countenance in early youth, but the expression had gained in depth and intensity more than it had lost in brightness. And then, when she did smile, it was with ineffable sweetness, a gleam of sunshine upon the deep sea. Her eyes were fixed upon her lover, and those who knew her well could read in them satisfaction, love, hope, nay, more than hope, a pride, the only pride that she could know, that he whom she had chosen in her girlhood, to whom she had remained true and faithful through years of sorrow and unexampled trial, had proved himself in every way worthy of her first affection and her long constancy. But where was Zara? Where Sir Edward Digby? For neither of them were present at the time. From the laws of attraction between different terrestrial bodies, we have every reason to infer that Digby and Zara were not very far apart. However, they had been somewhat eccentric in their orbits, for Zara had gone out a couple of hours before, Digby being then absent, no one knew where, upon a charitable errand, to carry consolation and sympathy to the cottage of poor Mrs. Clare, whose daughter had been committed to the earth the day before. How it happened, heaven only knows, but certain it is that at the moment I now speak of, she and Digby were walking home together, towards Harborne House, while his servant led his horse at some distance behind. Before they reached the house, however, a long conversation had taken place between the personages in the drawing-room, of which I shall only give the last few sentences. "It is true, Harry, it is true," said Sir Robert Croyland, in replying to something just spoken by Leighton, "and we have both things to forgive, but you far more than I have. And as you have set me an example of doing good for evil, and atoning by every means for a slight error, I will not be backward to do the same, and to acknowledge that I have acted most wrongly towards you, for which may heaven forgive me, as you have done. I have small means of atoning for much that is past, but to do so, as far as possible, freely and with my full consent, take the most valuable thing I have to give, my dear child's hand. Nay, hear me yet a moment. I wish your marriage to take place as soon as possible. I have learned to doubt of time, and never to trust the future. Say a week, a fortnight, Edith, but let it be speedily. It is my wish, let me say for the last time, it is my command." "But, brother Robert," exclaimed Mrs. Barbara, ruining her embroidery irretrievably in the agitation of the moment, "you know it can't be so very soon, for there are all the dresses to get ready, and the settlements to be drawn up, and 1,000 things to buy, and our cousins in Yorkshire must be informed, and—" "Our cousins in Yorkshire!" exclaimed Mr. Zachary Croyland. "Now, my dear Bab, tell me candidly whether you have or have not any nice little plan ready for spoiling the whole and throwing us all into confusion again. Don't you think you could just send Edith to visit somebody in the smallpox? Or get Harry Leighton run through in a duel, or some other little comfortable consummation which may make us all as unhappy as possible?" "Really, brother Zachary, I don't know what you mean," said Mrs. Barbara, looking the picture of injured innocence. "I dare say not, Bab," answered Mr. Croyland, "but I understand what you mean, and I tell you it shall not be. Edith shall fix the day, and as a good child she will obey her father and fix it as early as possible. When once fixed, it shall not be changed or put off on any account or consideration whatever, if my name's Croyland. As for the dresses, don't you trouble your head about that. I'll undertake the dresses and have them all down from London by the coach. Give me the size of your waist, Edith, upon a piece of string, and your length from shoulder to heel, and leave all the rest to me. If I don't dress her like a Mohammedan princess, may I never hear Bismillah again." Edith smiled, but answered, "I don't think that will be at all necessary, my dear uncle, to put you to the trouble, and I do not think it would answer its purpose if you took it." "But I will have my own way," said Mr. Croyland. "You are my pet, and all the matrimonial arrangements shall be mine. If you don't mind, and say another word, I'll insist upon being bridesmaid too, for I can encroach in my demands, I tell you, as well as a lady or a prime minister." As he spoke, the farther progress of the discussion was interrupted by the entrance of Zara, followed by Sir Edward Digby. Her colour was a little heightened, and her manner somewhat agitated, but she shook hands with her uncle and Leighton, neither of whom she had seen before during that morning, and then passing by her father in her way towards Edith, She whispered a word to him as she went. "What? What?" exclaimed Sir Robert Croyland, suddenly turning round towards Digby with a look of alarm and pressing his left hand upon his side. "She says you have something important to tell me, Sir Edward. Pray speak, I have no secrets from those who are around me." "I am sure what I have to say will shock all present," replied Sir Edward Digby gravely. "But the fact is, I heard a report this morning from my servant that Mr. Radford had destroyed himself last night in prison, and I rode over as fast as I could to ascertain if the rumour was correct. I found that it was but too accurate, and that the unhappy man terminated a career of crime by the greatest that he could commit." "Well, that's one rascal less in the world, that's some comfort," said Mr. Zachary Croyland. "I would rather, indeed, he had let someone else hang him instead of doing it himself, for I don't approve of suicide at all. It's foolish and wicked and cowardly. Still, nothing else could be expected from such a man. But what's the matter with you, Robert? You seem ill. Surely you can't take this man's death much to heart." Sir Robert Croyland did not reply, but made a faint sign to open the window, which was immediately done, and he revived under the influence of the air. "I will go out for a few minutes," he said, rising, and Edith, instantly starting up, approached to go with him. He would not suffer her, however. "No, my child," he replied to her offer. "No, you can understand what I feel, but I shall be better presently. Stay here and let all this be settled. And remember, Edith, name the earliest day possible. Arrange with Zara and Digby. Theirs can take place at the same time." Thus saying, he went out, and was seen walking slowly to and fro upon the terrace for some minutes after. In the meanwhile, the war had commenced between Mr. Zachary Croyland and his younger niece. "Ah, Mrs. Madcap," he exclaimed, "so I hear tales of you. The coquette has been caught at length. You are going to commit matrimony, and as birds of a feather flock together, the wild girl and the wild boy must pair." With her usual light, graceful step, and with her usual gay and brilliant smile, Zara left Sir Edward Digby's side and crossed over to her uncle, rested both her hands upon his arm, while he stood as erect and stiff as a finger-post, gazing down upon her with a look of sour fun. But in Zara's eyes, beautiful and beaming as they were, there was a look of deeper feeling than they usually displayed when jesting, as was her wont, with Mr. Croyland. "Well, chit," he said, "well, what do you want? A new gown, or a smart hat, or a riding-whip with a tiger's head in gold at the top?" "No, my dear uncle," she answered, "but I want you not to tease me, nor to laugh at me, nor to abuse me just now. For once in my life I feel that I must be serious, and I think even less teasing than ordinary might be too much for me. Perhaps, one time or another, you may find out that poor Zara's coquetry was more apparent than real, and that though she had an object, it was a better one than you, in your benevolence, were disposed to think." An unwonted drop swam in her eyes as she spoke, and Mr. Croyland gazed down upon her tenderly for a moment. Then, throwing his arms round her, he kissed her cheek. "I know it, my dear," he said. "I know it. Edith has told me all, and she who has been a kind, good sister will, I am sure, be a kind, good wife. Here, take her away, Digby. A better girl doesn't live, whatever I may have said. The worst of it is, she is a great deal too good for you, or any other wild harum-scarum fellow. But stay, he continued, as Digby came forward, laughing, and took Zara's hand. Here's something with her, for, as I am sure you will be a couple of spendthrifts, it is but fit that you should have something to set out upon." Mr. Croyland, as he spoke, put his hand into the somewhat wide and yawning pocket of his broad-tailed coat, and produced his pocket-book, from which he drew forth a small slip of paper. Digby took it and looked at it, but instantly held it out again to Mr. Croyland, saying, "My dear sir, it is quite unnecessary. I claim nothing but her hand, and that is mine by promises which I hope will not be very long ere they are fulfilled." "Nonsense, nonsense!" cried Mr. Croyland, putting away the paper with the back of his hand. "Did ever anyone see such a fool? I tell you, Sir Edward Digby, I'm as proud a man as you are, and you shall not marry my niece without receiving the same portion as her sister possesses. I hate all eldest sons, as you well know, and I don't see why eldest daughters should exist either. I'll have them all equal, no differences here. I've made up to Zara the disparity which one fool of an uncle thought fit to put between her and Edith. Such was always my intention, and moreover, let it be clearly understood that when you have put this old carrion underground, what I leave is to be divided between them, all equal, co-heiresses of Zachary Croyland, Esquire, surnamed the Nabob, alias the Misanthrope, and then, if you like it, you may each bear in your arms a crow rampant on an escutcheon of pretence." Thank you, my dear uncle," answered Edith Croyland, while Zara's gay heart was too full to let her speak. "Thank you for such thought of my sweet sister, for indeed to me, during long years of sorrow and trouble, she has been the spirit of consolation, comfort, strength, even hope." Poor Zara was overpowered, and she burst into tears. It seemed as if all the feelings which, for the sake of others, she had so long suppressed, all the emotions, anxieties, and cares which she had conquered or treated lightly, in order to give aid and support to Edith, rushed upon her at once in the moment of joy, and overwhelmed her. "Why, what's the foolish girl crying about?" exclaimed Mr. Croyland, but then, drawing her kindly to him, he added, "Come, my dear, we will make a truce upon the following conditions. I won't tease you any more, and you shall do everything I tell you. In the first place, then, wipe your eyes and dry up your tears, for if Digby sees how red your cheeks can look when you've been crying, he may find out that you are not quite such a Venus as he fancies just now. There, go along," and he pushed her gently away from him. While this gayer conversation had been going on within, Mr. Osborne had passed through the glass doors and was walking slowly up and down with Sir Robert Croyland. The subject they spoke upon must have been grave, for there was gloom upon both their faces when they returned. "I know it," said Sir Robert Croyland to his companion as they entered the room. "I am quite well aware of it. It is that which makes me urge speed." "If such be your view," replied Mr. Osborne, "you are right, Sir Robert, and heaven bless those acts which are done under such impressions." The party in the drawing-room heard no more, and notwithstanding the kindly efforts of Mrs. Barbara, and 1,000 little impediments which, with the very best motives in the world, she created or discovered, all the arrangements for the double marriage were made with great promptitude and success. At the end of somewhat less than a fortnight, without any noise or parade, the two sisters stood together at the altar, and pledged their troth to those they truly loved. Sir Robert Croyland seemed well and happy, for during the last few days previous to the wedding, both his health and spirit had apparently improved. But, ere a month was over, both his daughters received a summons to return as speedily as possible to Harborne House. They found him on the bed of death, with his brother and Mr. Osborne sitting beside him. But their father greeted them with a well-contented smile, and reproved their tears in a very different tone from that which he had been generally accustomed to use. "My dear children," he said in a feeble voice, "I have often longed for this hour, and though life has become happier now, I have for many weeks seen death approaching, and have seen it without regret. I did not think it would have been so slow, and that was the cause of my hurrying your marriage, for I longed to witness it with my own eyes, yet was unwilling to mingle the happiness of such a union with the thought that it took place while I was in sickness and danger. My brother will be a father to you, I am sure, when I am gone, but still it is some satisfaction to know that you have both better protectors, even here on earth, than he or I could be. I trust you are happy, and believe me, I am not otherwise, though lying here with death before me." Towards 4 o'clock on the following day, the windows of Harborne House were closed, and about a week after, the mortal remains of Sir Robert Croyland were conveyed to the family vault in the village church. Mr. Croyland succeeded to the estates and title of his brother, but he would not quit the mansion which he himself had built, leaving Mrs. Barbara with a handsome income, which he secured to her, to act the Lady Bountiful of Harborne House. The fate of Edith and Zara we need not farther trace. It was such as might be expected from the circumstances in which they were now placed. We will not venture to say that it was purely happy, for when was ever pure and unalloyed happiness found on earth? There were cares, there were anxieties, there were griefs from time to time, for the splendid visions of young imagination may be prophetic of joys that shall be ours, if we deserve them in our trial here, but are never realized within the walls of our mortal prison, and recede before us to take their stand for ever beyond the portals of the tomb. But still they were as happy as human beings perhaps ever were, for no peculiar pangs or sufferings were destined to follow those which had gone before, and in their domestic life, having chosen well and wisely, they found, as everyone will find, who judges upon such grounds, that love, when it is pure, and high, and true, is a possession to the brightness of which even hope can add no sweetness, imagination no splendour, that it does not in itself possess. The reader may be inclined to ask the after-fate of some of the other characters mentioned in this work. In regard to many of them I must give an unsatisfactory reply. What became of most, indeed, I do not know. The name of Mole, the officer of customs, is still familiar to the people of Hythe and its neighbourhood. It is certain that Ramley and one of his sons were hanged, but the rest of the records of that respectable family are, I fear, lost to the public. Little Starlight seems to have disappeared from that part of the country for some time, and in truth I have no certainty that the well-known pickpocket, Knight Ray, who was transported to Botany Bay some 30 years after the period of this tale, and was shot in an attempt to escape, was the same person whose early career is here recorded. But of one thing the reader may be perfectly certain, that, whatever was the fortune which attended any of the persons I have mentioned, whether worldly prosperity or temporary adversity befell them, the real, the solid good, the happiness of spirit, was awarded in exact proportion to each as their acts were good and their hearts were pure. End of chapter 13. End of The Smuggler by George Payne Rainsford James.